Galen, we've admitted everyone into the room. I think we can make a start.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Carla. So welcome to everyone with a big smile, wherever you might be in the world on this beautiful day in Colorado here. That's still dark. So I would like to acknowledge we have our chair, Gabriela Dias, son, with us today. We're expecting Carolyn Lee, the deputy chair, to be with us at least in part of our meeting. And did we say that we have Dave Sullivan from the PIOB? Hi, Dave. Welcome. So it's a continuation. Our day 2, we're going to start off with the Sustainability Working Group, who is chaired by Mark Babington. He will give us an update on the working group's most recent activities and what they are seeing in the way forward. So, Mark, the time is certainly yours at this point.
Thank you very much, Galen, and hello to everyone. We'll just get the slides up and then I'll begin to work through those. And then obviously free to take any questions that members of the CAG have. So if we can go to the next slide, please. What I want to do in this session is provide you with an update on what the Sustainability Working Group has been focusing on since your last meeting. Some of the things I want to focus on particularly are how we've sought to understand and address the responses to the sustainability questions in our strategy survey. I'll give you some of our current thinking about the way in which we're developing a project plan, which the board will be asked to consider at its meeting in late November, early December, and how we propose to address some of the challenges that sustainability poses. And then I also want to touch briefly on a publication that's been developed, a staff publication on greenwashing and how the code applies in greenwashing type situations. So if we can move to the next slide, please. And I should say, as well as being able to sort of take any questions, there are other members I know of the working group. I've certainly seen Jens and Vanya already dial in. So hopefully we'll have an opportunity to call on the wider team as well, and possibly not just me. In terms of our objectives, one of the things that the board asked us to do at the June meeting was in effect develop a vision for what IESBA should do in relation to standard setting for sustainability reporting and sustainability assurance. And as part of that, we've sought to raise awareness amongst our stakeholders of the way in which the code can be applied to sustainability type engagements, and also analysis of the code to really understand the work that needs to be done. We've also carried out a lot of fact-finding and stakeholder outreach, and part of that is to help us coordinate our work. So absolutely critical to this is close alignment and coordination with the IESBA, which is developing sustainability assurance standards to a similar timetable, and our work with the ISSB, which of course is now working post-consultation to finalise its first 2 standards. As part of that engagement, we are also heavily involved in discussions with IOSCO and IOSCO's Sustainable Finance Working Group. If we can go to the next slide, please. This just gives you a brief summary of some of the things that have happened since the last meeting of the CAG. So along with Gabriela, we had a sustainability webinar to discuss the role of ethics in sustainability reporting and assurance. And of course, you will have seen IESBA's press release committing to work in support of the sustainability agenda by readying our ethics and independence standards to support the ongoing developments at the ISSB. We also submitted a comment letter to the ISSB, and in that we sought to explain the importance of high standards of ethical behaviour and high standards of independence in sustainability engagements. We've also been monitoring what's going on in the background. So two important pieces. You'll be aware, of course, that the US Securities and Exchange Commission consulted on changes to its rules, or proposed changes to its rules, to improve sustainability reporting. And also more recently, we've seen a final consolidated text of the European Union's CSRD published, so the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And those initiatives have both been extremely important in informing the working group's discussions. We were very pleased to see the FSB issuing a release to set out progress on addressing climate-related risks. And in that, it recognised the contribution that IESBA and the IAASB have in developing a baseline for global standards. And then more recently, we've seen a statement from IOSCO in which it sets out its vision for sustainability reporting, and made very encouraging statements about the work being carried out by IESBA and the IAASB. And the focus there, and I think the focus of a lot of our discussions with the regulatory community, have been to recognise that we need to develop standards in a sort of professionally agnostic way. And I'll talk about that in a little more detail later. You'll also see on this slide in terms of our engagement, so the IAASB, the IESBA, IOSCO, the Forum of Firms, and GRI as some of those critical stakeholders that we've engaged with. If we can go on to the next slide, please. One of the areas of strategic focus in the survey that IESBA issued was sustainability reporting and assurance. And there were three specific questions in the survey which sought to get stakeholder feedback. If we can go on to the next slide, please. What our stakeholders told us is that there was strong support for IESBA to develop a standard-setting project relating to sustainability reporting and assurance, and many commented that that was urgently needed and was not something that could be delayed into the next strategy period. Hence the decision of the board to commission the working group to develop proposals. Of course, our stakeholders also stressed the importance of collaboration, which has very much driven our work from the outset. And you'll see there some of the comments that were received. So I think one of the interesting ones for us that we've considered really carefully as the working group is this idea that the same independence rule should apply to sustainability assurance. And what we sort of take that to mean is that sustainability information and its assurance is increasingly used for capital allocation decisions, and therefore it's important that that information is as reliable as financial information that would traditionally have been used. And I think the message that comes across very strongly is that the same high standards of independence that apply to the audit of a set of financial statements should apply to sustainability assurance engagements. And that's a message that landed very strongly with the working group. We recognise that sustainability is a significant public interest issue, and therefore we need to work with the global regulatory community and national standard setters to work out how we can ensure that the code provides material that's not only usable by professional accountants, but also by the more diverse pool of providers that operate in the sustainability space. And of course, one of the things that has not been underestimated by us is the significant need for resource that this drives. Beyond that, our stakeholders were providing solutions or proposed solutions as to how we could deal with sustainability. And if we can go on to the next slide, please. We'll see some of the sort of questions and some of the issues that were proposed sort of through the survey. A recognition that at the moment there are no comprehensive globally accepted ethics and independent standards for sustainability, and we want to make sure that the code is absolutely fit for purpose and in that gap. And I think the other thing that a number of stakeholders were keen to recognise is that it's not just about the ethics and independence, it's about how that integrates together with assurance, with monitoring, with inspection, with quality management, and with a robust sort of professional competence and skills. And indeed, that's one of the things that's driving our ongoing engagement and discussions with IOSCO in particular. A big concern to address is, you know, this concern that other assurance providers operating in this space may not be subject to the same standards as professional accountants, particularly where they come from an unregulated profession. And indeed, again, the message that's been emphasised all the way through is about integration and coordination. So if we can go on to the next slide, please. In terms of our considerations so far as a working group, we've spent a lot of time researching the relevant legal and regulatory developments in different jurisdictions. We've considered how we best meet the public interest in the context of both sustainability reporting and sustainability assurance. And a significant exercise has been carried out to review the provisions of the code from beginning to end through a sustainability lens, which allows us to identify areas for potential enhancement and also allows us to close any gaps that might be in the code to deal with sustainability related work. We've also sought to learn from the other work that IESBA is carrying out, in particular the work of our technology colleagues, the exposure draft that's been developed and respondents' responses. And of course, there are also lessons that we can learn from the work of our tax planning colleagues on the board, and we're making sure that we factor all those in to the wider project plan that's being developed. In terms of other issues, I've mentioned briefly the publication on greenwashing, and I'll cover that later. But we've also launched a web page that's on the IESBA site, and we're using that to bring together all of our material, relevant articles, things to raise awareness and communicate to our stakeholders. And the final sort of challenge for us is how we engage with assurance providers who are not professional accountants, so we understand the ethical and independence issues that need to be addressed. If we can go on to the next slide, please. I'll go now through some of our current analysis. So I think the first thing that I would say is that there's pretty much universal agreement that the fundamental principles of the code and the conceptual framework in part 1 are absolutely fit for purpose to support sustainability engagements. And that's something that came through as a clear message from pretty much everyone that we've engaged with. What our analysis work has done, and I've said that we looked at the code through a sustainability lens, is we need to make some enhancements to parts 2 and 3 of the code. So for professional accountants in business, the focus is very much about refining the terminology we use, providing some examples and context, and building some more material into sections 220 and 230. And as part of that, again, we'll draw on the experience of the technology-related revisions to the code that the task force is in the process of finalising. For professional accountants in public practice, we want to take the work that we're planning on section 220 to develop a new section in section 3, and that will focus on professional accountants and firms preparing and presenting information, sustainability information, which is currently a gap that we've identified. In terms of the international independence standards, we're very much looking at the examples provided by the SEC and the European Commission about their assessment of independent standards necessary to drive high quality sustainability work. What both of those do is recognise the high standards of independence that apply in audit engagements and in effect parallel those across. So for those of you who've not seen in detail CSRD, the consolidated text, in the audit regulation and directive, we had the concept of a key audit partner. In the CSRD, we have a key sustainability partner. And indeed, in the text itself, what we're actually seeing is references to a number of the critical areas of the code, and we can see how the code can be used for these types of engagement. So therefore, with this in mind, the independence threshold that should apply, the working group believes should be a high bar, recognising that public interest issue. And so therefore, the model for the work that we're doing very much focuses on Part 4A of the code, although we recognise that there may be work over a longer term to also align Part 4B of the code. And the reason for that, and we've tried to make sure that we develop a proposal for the board to consider that has a proper conceptual underpinning, and it's because the sustainability framework that the ISSB is developing is in a sense aligned to a general purpose fair presentation framework of a high level of public interest. And of course, that allows it to align with the conceptual framework that underpins the work of the IFRS Foundation and its boards. And this would mean, of course, that sustainability assurance providers would need to be independent of the entity and not only of the subject matter information that they're being asked to assure. So if we can go on to the next slide, please. Again, emphasising that because of the public interest nature of sustainability reporting, Part 4B is not a sufficiently high bar. That's the working group's position that we're developing for the project plan. And we're also considering how we meet the needs of our stakeholders. So although the code is a code for professional accountants, how do we ensure that that is accessible by those who are working in this space who are not professional accountants? And I'll explain that in a little more detail when I set out the work strands that the working group is in the process of developing for the project plan. But I say the thing that underpins everything is that the same independence and ethics standards will apply to audit and to sustainability assurance. And obviously key to that is our ongoing engagement with regulators and with other stakeholders. So if we can go on to the next slide, please. This sets out the 4 work streams, and the intention is that IESBA will be asked to consider an exposure draft in September 2023. We hope that will be issued then. So the first strand of the work is very much focused on the ethics of the code, developing sustainability related ethics provisions in parts 2 and 3. It needs some updating to the code, greater help to navigate greenwashing pressures, and also a more diverse range of data suppliers, many of whom might be third parties. The second strand is very much looking at the international independence standards. So a way of navigating to provide specific criteria to explain how the independence provisions apply in the context of sustainability information. And we will develop a new Part 4 that sits above Parts 4A and B to explain this. We are looking to coordinate our work very closely with the IEESB about specialists. This is a wider issue than just sustainability, but sustainability raises particular questions about specialists that might require revisions to the code. We're going to do this work and ensure that it's there to support wider activity by IESBA and also engagement with the IEESB, who are considering looking at a project to revise ISA 620. And that will be another significant product. And then the fourth strand is in a sense the development of some non-authoritative guidance, a standalone handbook, which will help those who are not professional accountants apply the code in the context of sustainability related engagements. If we can move on to the next slide, please. So one of the big questions that we continue to work on, and indeed we've got engagement in the next couple of weeks on this, is the question of expanding the code's requirements to other professionals. That will rely on targeted engagement with the national standard setter and regulatory community. Gabriela is also heavily involved in those discussions as our chair, working and liaising with IOSCO, the FSB, and with the IEESB. And we're looking at how we can bring together a forum to provide us with perspectives and insight from all of those who operate in this sector. I'm going to pause there before I go on to the greenwashing publication and really offer a chance for people to ask any questions or raise any comments, if that's all right with you, Galen.
Yeah, that's perfectly fine, Mark, and thank you for that background. I might note that I was invited as an observer, and I'm pretty familiar with everything that Mark has presented here. I'll kick off with one question, though, even though I have been involved with this with the working group, Mark. You mentioned a key sustainability partner. And from an integration standpoint, we've always had one person that we could look to when we're talking about an audit, and that's the engagement partner having responsibility for the audit. How do you see sustainability being integrated? And I know that's a concept very close to the heart of Vanya. Vanya and I have discussed that, this integration of the financial statements and sustainability. Do you see a sharing of responsibility for sustainability, or will that lie with the key sustainability partner?
I think the answer to that, Galen, is it will very much depend on jurisdiction, and it will depend on the direction of travel over the next few years. I think what was really interesting in the SEC consultation on changes to rules is it recognised a series of steps over time as the quality and scope of sustainability reporting would expand and the level of assurance that would be provided over it would grow. And I know a number of jurisdictions are thinking already about the extent to which they will be requiring companies to produce an integrated report that contains all of this information together, or will they be providing an additional report? And I think that will very much drive that model. But I think the key sustainability partner question is a recognition by the European Commission that sustainability related work may require some different skills and different capacities to an audit engagement partner. But we need to remember one thing, and that is that the key audit partner is someone designated by the audit firm. I presume in a similar way, the key sustainability partner will be designated by the audit firm. It may be that the key audit partner and the key sustainability partner can be one and the same, where that person has the appropriate skills and capabilities to be able to deliver all of that work. But obviously, we'll continue to need to engage with stakeholders and other regulatory authorities to make sure that we draft the code in a way that can accommodate changes.
Thank you, Mark. I'm seeing quite a response here, some raised hands. My good friend and colleague, Jim Dalkin, who is our IESBA, IEESB CAG chair. Jim, you have the floor.
Thanks, Galen. And I just, you referenced it, but I just wanted to follow up on one point, and that in the US environment, and this is for non-public companies, there's been a groundswell of interest in, let's say, an IPA developing a very strong consulting arm to do all the related work that would be required for sustainability. And I think heretofore, it's always been thought that we can use sort of a parallel view in terms of non-audit services, and the client would have to oversee those non-audit services and understand what they're doing. But there's also been discussion that there's more risk here because this is a new area. So if the audit firm, if they have a consulting arm that does all the work, that they're subsequently auditing whether or not management would be able to take responsibility for all the work that's being done for sustainability. And therefore, do you need to have additional guardrails that perhaps you do not need in a traditional financial statement other than what you currently have? Thanks.
Jim, what do you mean by IPA? I'm not sure everybody's.
An auditor, an audit firm, independent public auditor.
Okay. Mark, would you like to take all the questions, or?
Yes. Do you want to deal with others, and then I'll come back and answer a number, Galen?
Yeah, if you will. So Harrison.
Okay, thank you, Galen. Yeah, I guess the one question I have and some concerns I have is how we can apply the code to non-members, like non-CPAs, non-audit firms, and where do we get the authority to do that? And even as far as inspecting their work, or having an independent agency inspect their work, such as the in the US, the PCOB or the AICPA's peer review program. And I guess I'm concerned about that, how we can write standards that would be applicable to firms and individuals who are not members of the professional CPA societies.
Thank you, Harrison. Hilda?
Good afternoon, at least for me, and thank you, Mark, for your presentation. And part of it is actually related to the comments or the questions that have already been made. When we look at sustainability, we look very much at sustainability reporting and standards, and sustainability assurance and its standards. And both of those are very important and are in development in all parts of the world. And so from the sustainability reporting point of view, we very much see, like you have proposed in slide 11, that there is a consideration that needs to be made. What does that mean for people in practice and people within the preparers community? So we see very much, as you have in slide 11, that that's something you need to take forward. And when we look at sustainability assurance, we believe that that is the trigger for the independence and the ethics considerations. And what do I mean by that? We have an expectation that whoever the service provider will be for sustainability assurance, that hopefully they will use the standard that the IESB is developing for sustainability assurance. And it is by this standard that there will be a requirement for them to have ethical and independence requirements. And so that's how they would get into the code. And so from that point of view, we see that indeed that should not just be for professionals in practice, it should be for everybody who is a service provider on sustainability assurance. And that's how we would expect, Harrison asked a question on that, that's how we would expect they would come within the application of the code, or at least that's how we hope they would come in. And so it is important to indeed pay attention to that. And so what does that mean? We were a little bit, you were referring to a new part in section 4 or an overall part. And it would be good if you could be a bit more specific, because we are not very clear of what that would mean or what you would address in this, because I think we all agree that whether it's financial statement audit or whether it is sustainability reporting assurance or audit, this is in the public interest, and the independence requirements would basically be needing to be the same based on independent of who is the service provider. So we weren't quite sure what this new section would do. We can definitely see that there is expansion of the existing sections that would be needed. And you know, as far as the consideration on specialists and then the other matters you have in slide 11 overall, you know, we can see that that is the matters that you should focus on and that you should be involved on. So in conclusion, overall supportive of the project. We believe there is already a lot there in the code that can also be used, and that should also be applicable in the same way for sustainability reporting and sustainability assurance. And you know, we see the need that some of that might need to be refined, but the starting all over again, a new section, we weren't quite sure. Thank you.
Thank you, Hilda. Akihiro?
Thank you, Garen. Thank you very much, Mark, for your very clear presentation. First of all, I overall support the status and future plan of this very important project. There is adopting agile approach and proposing a strategic focus. As Mark introduced, IOSCO released the statement supporting and encouraging the work of IESBA and IWSB last week. As included in this statement, we expect to continue to engage and collaborate with wider stakeholders with keeping in mind the balance between timeliness and due process. And I'd like to mention two general comments. The first point is the diversity of the members. I think that it is great and useful to establish 4 work streams for the quick development. In this case, it is very important to ensure enough resources members with appropriate experience and expertise, especially in the sustainability area, taking into account the various situations regarding reporting and assurance from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. It is crucial to have diverse members of working group, work stream in terms of market development and geography, I think. The second point is responding to non-PAs. As noted in IOSCO's statement, profession agnostic standards are important in sustainability area. Also considering the current situation of global practice, the inclusive standard setting that is including non-PAs is crucial. So I believe that the code, not only for PAs, but also for non-PAs, need to be developed in a timely manner. That's my comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Akihiro. I believe SXP is Sandra Peters, but I'm not quite sure, and I see her hand up. Sandra Peters from CFA.
Yeah, hi. Sorry about that. I need to change that. My apologies. That's the auto setting. And I'm new to the IASB CAG, so I apologize if my comments are. I'm just sort of getting up to speed with all of the projects, but as I listened to the presentation by Mark, it was great. And but as I think about it from the context of an investor perspective, we have said, and you can see in our comment letter to the SEC, that we believe that the provider of assurance should be held to the same standards as in the context of the US, an accounting firm that is required to follow the PCAOB guidance. And that would apply across the globe, but to someone else's comment that this, who decides that, right? It's gonna, in my view, from an investor perspective, it's going to have to be decided by a regulator and implemented in that way. And that's something that we are very interested in and very concerned about, because the level and professionalism of the person providing assurance is very important to us. so I guess I would just offer that as a comment and an observation. In the context of the discussion about the audit partner versus sustainability partner, increasingly I'm becoming concerned is an overstatement, but it feels to me that we need case studies with respect to how assurance might be applied on some of these IESBA standards, for example. I'm just using them as an example, because as I went through and responded to the consultation, while there's a lot of subjectivity to here, and over time, that subjectivity only multiplies because the previous statements then have to be validated. And inherent in that are a lot of ethical challenges, I believe, for the assurance provider, because they're going to have to prove out that those statements were true or untrue, or how do they then navigate with the company that they can see that the statements previously made aren't panning out. And there's ethical challenges I perceive associated with there. And to me, it feels like the conversation needs to go down a level into some case studies. Just my observation, because I'm also worried about the linkage between the financial statements and the IESBA standards. The discussion of financial effects, for example, in the IESBA standards can be qualitative. That's optional. That's not something investors like, right? And these terms and definitions are not included in the IESBA standards. So how, to me, that's a real challenge to verification, be it assurance or some other sort of verification or provided by someone else. So to me, I feel the need to sort of drop down to some case studies about how some of these challenges, which we talked about on the IESBA CAG very briefly at the end on the last meeting, how those actually get resolved or what dilemmas they present, because I feel the need to move down to a level where we talk about them in the more tangible rather than the standards, because then we can then better inform the standards. So I apologize, that was a little bit longer than I had hoped, but these are the things that I'm thinking about in looking after investors' interests in how we really evaluate the efficacy of these standards.
Thank you, Sandra. And I see Conchita, you have your hand raised. Conchita, you're on mute. Not sure that we still have her. Jim, did you want to come back? No? Well, Mark, that's quite a bit. Maybe Conchita will come back, but would you like to respond at this point?
Yes, thank you, Galen, and thank you for the questions. I think Jim's point absolutely fair, and indeed when we were doing our sort of gap analysis on the code, one of the things was recognizing that in many situations you have management reliant on certain third-party providers, and therefore, you know, there is an issue over the ability to be able to properly challenge and assess that information. We're looking to develop material in the code that will do that, but also we recognise that is something that we need to investigate further with the IAASB as they look to develop their assurance standards and also link that into the relevant ethical framework, our code, and also the quality management approach. I think the question that Harrison raised, you know, we are in discussion with regulators because we recognise that they are the key, in a sense, to requiring those other than professional accountants to apply a consistent framework of ethics and independence. But there is also another route, and that is, you know, there's an important part for audit committee chairs to play, and that is if they're tendering for the provision of sustainability assurance and they appoint someone who is not a professional accountant, do they in that contract require the provider to use, for instance, the code in setting ethical and independence requirements, and to use whatever assurance standards the IAASB develop to ensure consistency of market practice. I realise that that's a sort of voluntary measure, but it is one that a number of people have said could be an attractive one. And of course, from a regulatory perspective as well, one of the questions we're looking at in the UK from a reform perspective is expanded powers to give us the right to look at the entire information within a company's annual report. And therefore, that would give regulatory tension over being able to look into these type of engagements as well as the audit of financial statements. I take the point that that Hilda made absolutely about the importance of the standards framework, and indeed having a consistent level of independence and ethics that would be applied. And of course, we work very closely with the IAASB in that respect. And I think a critical part of that is to ensure that there's alignment with the quality management framework that's been developed in the context of an audit, and that the relevant ethical standards, the applicable ethical standards, are the code. Akihito touched on the IOSCO statement, and we recognise that the very significant resourcing challenges for IESBA, and it's something that I know the planning committee will continue to discuss. One of the things that we need to do is ensure that we've got that diversity of views, and that we've got sufficient resource to deliver this very ambitious project. But we also need to make sure that IESBA speaks with one voice. And for instance, when we're engaging with the IAASB, this project can engage with one voice, not four voices, to make sure that we are all focused on delivering the same outcome. So there is going to be a lot of work for us in terms of coordination. And of course, I take the point about non-PAs that will be echoed by others. And I think, the point that Sandra made, yes, we continue to work with the regulatory community, because we do believe that same standard applies regardless of provider. I can see the attractiveness of case studies, and indeed one of the things that we've been considering is what non-authoritative material can be developed. I think one of the particular challenges of the IASB framework is that it does integrate non-financial and financial reporting. And therefore, the point that was made by IOSCO and others about these sort of agnostic standards need to reflect the fact that you are dealing with a range of different subject matter. But of course, for us, we recognise that, the code is about driving the right behaviour and mindset. And it's that right behaviour and mindset, regardless of the different types of subject matter that we have to provide. And I agree that it's a challenge, because we've got a lot more forward-looking information that will be subject to assurance. But it is a challenge that we adapt to. And I think, I would again refer to the SEC's consultation, which recognised a number of steps over the years towards implementation. And of course, the accountancy profession had to adapt to a much wider consideration of forward-looking information when it was dealing with, for instance, the audit of expected credit losses in financial services. So they're all important messages for us to take on board. And obviously, I hope in due course to be back before the CAG to explain how we've developed our thinking of the project proposal in more detail in responding to these important points. So thank you.
I don't see any other hands up, Mark. So you wanted to continue in your presentation then?
Yeah, yes, thank you, Galen. So if we could just go on to the next slide, please. I just wanted to briefly touch on can we go back one? I think we jumped to there. No, back and back again, please. Yeah, we've got the draft staff guidance on greenwashing. So we will be issuing a staff publication, which is very much focused on highlighting how the code can be used to address stakeholders' concerns about greenwashing. It's a Q&A format. It's been developed with input from the working group, the wider IESBA board membership, and also from staff from IFAC and the IAASB. We've also shared it with IOSCO, GRI, and it's been shared in my own organisation. The board considered the publication at the September meeting we held recently, and the staff are now in the process of finalising that to issue it. So I just wanted to flag that as something that will be added to our web page on the IESBA website in due course. So please look out for it. If we can go on, please, to the next slide and the next one after that, just to say our next steps in terms of where we go from here. So we have a discussion with the planning committee around work streams, so we can finalise the project plan that will go to the board later this year. We'll be continuing our outreach with key stakeholders, and we have a board call on November the 1st, so we can update the board on how we're developing the project plan and ensure that we are able to take direction from the board and deal with any of their questions. And then we will get in December, or the start of December, when we have our board meeting, an update from the IAASB to ensure we're aligned. And Deanne and I have already had a chat with the relevant IAASB staff, and Lynn Provost, who chairs the IAASB's task force, and we'll be asking the board to approve the sustainability project plan. And last of all, there is a proposal for an IOSCO roundtable in December, and we hope to be able to participate in that as well. But those are all of the things I wanted to cover, Galen. So if there are any questions from anyone, I'm very happy to deal with those, but that's everything I wanted to cover.
I'm talking with being on mute. That's hard to do, isn't it? So thank you, Mark, for that, you know, all the points that you have made in the presentation. I'm going to give everyone else a chance. And since we have some time left, I'll just mention one thing. Last week at the board meeting, I had talked about Vanya a moment ago. I had a very enlightening discussion. We're all learning about this, and I think if we have financial reporting backgrounds, it's a little bit tough to get through some of the concepts that are being put forth on sustainability. One thing that occurred to me after that conversation that I had with Vanya about integration is that we're not necessarily talking about integrating what's on the balance sheet or the income statement numbers. That's looking at it as an accountant. Even though sustainability impacts the numbers when we're talking about impairments of long life assets, we take all that into account. But I think the people that are talking about integration are looking at it more from a narrative standpoint. Is that consistent with your views, Mark, or are we talking about something differently? Are we talking about actually integrating the accounting that takes place, or is it something different?
So it will be interesting to see, Galen, where the ISSB get to in finalising their standards. I know the board is considering the huge number of comment letters they received, I think over 1,300 of them. I think what we see is that sustainability in its early years has been very focused on non-financial disclosure. And actually what we're seeing is increasing sophistication where reporters are recognising that non-financial disclosure also has impacts on the financial statements themselves, as you say, because of the impact that it has on particular assets and the recognition of liabilities within company financial statements. So we are seeing a more integrated approach, and we need to remember as well that, of course, the ISSB is developing its proposals, but drawing heavily on the work of its predecessor bodies, in particular the IIRC. So an integrated approach is absolutely critical to what's going on here. I wonder whether, because I see her on the screen, whether Vanya might want to come in on this point, because of course she's got a lot of expertise in this area, having been heavily involved for a number of years. Vanya, do you want to add to that?
Yes, please, Mark. Glad to, and good to see you again, and many friends from my period at CAG, at IESBA CAG in the past. What happens is that we need reliability in sustainability information. We do not want sustainability information without evidence. And the big solution for that is to have sustainability integrated with the financial information that will be released. But what ISSB is working right now is not in standards for us to record sustainability effects, but to disclose the effect of financial decisions over companies. So we are not talking about recognizing liabilities or assets that are connected to sustainability aspects. And that's why, Gideon, I told you that it will not come necessarily in the financial statements. It can be in the web page, it can be in a separate report, it can be in a press release. The format is not yet established, but the end result will be that wherever the vehicle, the information that we'll be releasing will be connected to the financial one, so it can be audited, so it can be verified, so the market can use this information in a very safe way in order to make decisions.
Thank you, Vanya. That is important. That's important background. If you can wait just a second,
Sure.
Conchita, I neglected to get you back in from the earlier conversation. Conchita, do you want to weigh in? Conchita, you're on mute. Conchita?
Okay, thank you. My apologies, I got disconnected a number of times. I raised my hand much earlier, and my apologies if I got disconnected. I just want to cite a few things, and I don't know whether they were covered when I got disconnected, but I believe the issue on sustainability reporting is completely different from audit report. Because in audit report, you express an opinion on the fair presentation of the financial statements. However, in sustainability reporting, I would like to, my view there is that the report is using the ESG lens, so to speak, and you deal with enormous data, and it is a question of like disclosing what you have found out. That's why it's reporting. And whether you are to express an opinion or not is something I don't know whether that is the output. Okay, and I'm looking at will that be the output of sustainability reporting, or just reporting what the data would probably come up with, what the data will lead you to report on. Now, one major consideration is the enormity of the data. If you look at it, the lens of ESG. And therefore, technology is involved, but kind of technology you are to use. Okay, and so that the data will be processed and all that. I don't know whether this will be included. Of course, independence and objectivity are expectations from the reporting, and of course, reliability. But I would like to look at it also from the point of view of capital market, because this is important for the capital market. The players, the investors are now looking at green financing and all that thing. So what kind of report is expected to address the expectations of the capital market? Will it lead to coming up with sustainability index? Will it lead to classification or categorizing entities? Maybe it's a new thing we're dealing with, but my point of view is that this is something new and we have to be very, very careful. We should exercise really due diligence and care. And this is not only the jurisdiction of professional accountants. And I read the report and it says one of the survey results said that whatever would be the standard that will be determined will apply to all professionals or to whoever will do the assurance work on sustainability reporting. I raised this issue much earlier in the last meeting, and I said, how will it apply? Can we impose on other disciplines, on other practitioners who are not professional accountants to adhere or follow the standards that the professional accountant standard setting body is putting up? How do you implement? How do you enforce? Maybe it's something new that I have many comments, and I'm sorry. Thank you.
You're fine. Thank you, Conchita. I see Wei Ming, you have your hand raised. Wei Ming.
Oh, thanks a lot. Thanks for the work and Mark's presentation. I would like to make a quick comment on the staff publication. I appreciate the IESBA has devoted much of its efforts to develop the staff publication, looking at the key ethics related challenges the publication identifies. I appreciate careful consideration has been made in preparing the staff publication. I noticed the first question and the third question are all about greenwashing, and they are related. I'm wondering whether those two questions can be consolidated into one question to present a whole picture about the relevance and applicability of the code. For example, the answer to question 1 tells the reader the code requires professional accountants to act in the public interest, which is a general requirement. And the answer to question 3 elaborates specific provisions in the code to safeguard against greenwashing. That's all. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Wei Ming. And Sandra, I see you have your hand raised.
Yeah, I was just going to respond to the comment you made, and then I think Vanya said something about whether the sustainability information should be connected to the financial statements. I think that I just wanted to add, as an investor organization, we unequivocally believe the answer is yes. And that, certainly there are investors who want to invest based on sustainability information that impacts value and some that impacts values, and they do not necessarily intersect, right? And we have taken the decision that we want to focus first on value relevant information, right? So our challenge with the sustainability information is getting it in a way that we can actually confirm, and I don't like to call it non-financial, I like to call it sort of pre-financial, if you will. The financial statements should show to investors and to auditors, should be confirmatory into that the statements that are being made, because they are very forward-looking, that the things actually happened, right? So we're very concerned that they be connected, and we're very concerned that the location is not all scattered where we have to go, as I think I wrote in one of our letters, we don't have to do the Where's Waldo, I don't know if you all know that book, of sustainability information to find it. So we are firmly in the category that they need to be connected, because we need to understand if the IESB's mandate, for example, is enterprise value, we need to demonstrate that it does impact enterprise value. And so does the IESB in making a decision to include that information. Otherwise, we're going to end up in a situation where the link to enterprise value can be very far. You know, how many degrees of separation do we need between something impacting the brand and having a direct impact on enterprise value? So I just wanted to add that, because we're so firmly in that category right now, and it is such an important issue in the United States in particular, as you watch the politics of this going on. So I just wanted to say, and I actually think it is in the best interest of auditors or whoever does the verification that be the case, because you'll never be able to confirm that these statements had any meaning unless you see a financial effect of them. So my 2 cents as an investor. Sorry, I'm kind of passionate about it right now.
I can see that, Sandra, and I agree with very much of what you say. I think another way of saying it might be that all information is financial, and all financial has an impact on what you might call non-financial. The challenge, I think, for accountants who are involved in the middle of this is, how do you measure some of these things? And that remains to be seen as to how that plays out. But Mark,
I wholeheartedly agree with that.
I see a couple other hands popping up. Harrison? Harrison, you're on mute, but.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you, Galen. As Sandra was talking, a thought just occurred to me about having controls over this sustainability reporting. And just as we have internal controls over financial reporting and other things, I was wondering what the thoughts might be on having internal control reporting or controls reporting over sustainability, because that's one thing that auditors do very well. Particularly in the U.S., we have a separate opinion on internal controls for certain entities that meet certain thresholds. So I was wondering what that would do, because that puts the onus back on management as to how they go about reporting on their sustainability, and then for review by at least professional accountants. And if these reports are prepared by others, I guess we'd be looking at management's responsibility for the overall responsibility for sustainability reporting, and maybe a need for looking at the controls and having if we're looking at reliance on that report, is there some way we would get to that? I'm just throwing that out there. So it just occurred to me while Sandra was talking from the perspective of investors. Thank you.
Those are good points. And Harrison, those issues about controls over sustainability are being raised. Vanya, I see you're coming back in.
Very quickly, thank you, Galen. Just to make Sandra be at ease, the purpose of IESB is to have financial and non-financial information integrated, it will be presented in such a way that you see the impact on them. And what is not yet decided is the vehicle. Would that be the management commentary? Would be the annual report? It will be another one, but they will be together in a single place, so you do not have to look at for it everywhere. So be at easy.
Thank you, Vanya. And I think it's Peter. You want to make a remark, Peter?
Thank you, Galen, and good afternoon from the OECD in Paris. I just wanted to recall the input of several of my colleagues at the OECD to your survey and to the strong support given notably by our Directorate for Financial and Enterprise Affairs and the Public Governance Directorate, who are attaching a high level of importance to your initiative. I note that some OECD analysis has shown that based on a sample of 3,000 listed corporations in 2021, representing half of the global market capitalization, 91% of companies provided assurance on their sustainability reports. And remarks from my colleagues that the focus should ensure that the IESBA's response is well adapted to ensure that all firms and organizations are able to adopt any standards it develops. A standard that would be too heavy or that would not include transitory measures, they feel is more likely to fail. And so the IESBA, we believe, needs to be very thoughtful about scope and scalability. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Mark, would you like to come back in and field some of those?
Thank you, Galen. On Conchita's points, I think that one of the key ones for me is that the ISSB's general reporting standard includes within the exposure draft a proposal that there is a report on compliance with the reporting framework. And so therefore, you know, that's why as a working group, we chose to sort of follow this conceptual model, which follows the same approach as for a general purpose fair presentation framework. Obviously, the opinion that ultimately, or the conclusion that ultimately gets put on sustainability information will depend on where our colleagues in the IAASB get, but also it will depend on the requirements of different jurisdictions, and therefore extremely important that we continue to liaise closely with them. I will take away Wei Mei's comment and pick up with IESBA staff, so thank you for that. In Sandra's comment, I think the thing that I take away very strongly, I share your concerns there, Sandra. I think the thing that I take away, and I've been saying for far too long, is the answer is it's about better information, not more information. And one of the things that that this has to sort of address, and this is not a sort of direct IESBA issue, but we have to address this issue that all of this information has to come together into decision useful information. And I think, you know, in recognizing the desire of all of our stakeholders to move quickly, we have to be able to sort of navigate a way through to produce high quality reporting. Harrison's point, controls in this space, absolutely. And one of the challenges that we have is that quite often the information systems and the controls that support them are less mature over some types of sustainability information than they are for financial reporting. And therefore there is work to be done to ensure that not only the information can be assured to an appropriate level, but of course that you can rely on the veracity of the underlying systems and their controls. And just to acknowledge, thank you, Peter, for your comments from the OECD, and absolutely recognise the challenge which the working group, and I know our colleagues on the wider IESBA board are firmly seized of.
Thank you, Mark. I would invite our PIOB observer if he had any observations from this discussion. Dave?
Thanks, Galen, and it's great to be here with everybody. Mark, first of all, thank you for an excellent presentation, and to everybody for the great feedback that you've given today. Clearly, this is a very, very important project, and I think we all get that, which I think is excellent. I think the measured approach that you described, Mark, sounds very reasonable. Obviously, timeliness is critically important. So I know I'm looking forward to seeing the project plan that you'll present to the board later this year. And just again, just want to commend you for all the work that you've accomplished already, because I know that has been a lot. I agree with the need to address whether or not the sustainability assurance could be provided by the financial statement auditor. I think that that's an important first step, and then, as some people have said, what guardrails need to be put in place in those situations. And then, while I recognize that it's challenging, I wholly support the goal to make the code of ethics accessible to other professionals, because I believe that it's in the public interest that they get information, and that the value of that information, the veracity of that information is consistent regardless of who the service provider might be. So thanks again, and Galen, thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you, Dave. And I see our chair, Gabriela, you would like maybe a final word here?
Thank you very much, Galen. I'm very well aware of my condition of a listener in these meetings, and I'm listening very attentively and taking the most of this discussion. But I would not like to miss this opportunity for a dialogue with all this important audience. And would just like to raise one or two topics. Thank you very much for all these very important and substantial contributions and questions. The questions here are as important as the answers, because we are still there trying to understand what we have to do, where we have to go, how we have to go, etc. There's one or two things that I'd like to highlight. First thing, some of the comments were about this possible application of the code or whatever of the IESBA standards in the future for non-PAs, and how can we enforce them, and etc. I fully understand that this is a question that is causing some is triggering some other questions. But what I would like to make clear is that we at IESBA, we are somehow takers and not givers of the framework. So what is there in terms of framework from the European Commission regulation, the SEC regulation, etc., is that the market is already open to others. It's not a decision, IESBA's decision. It was not our decision, and it is not in our hands to decide whether it is going to be open to the others or not. We only have to work with what is given. And what is given is that the market is going to be open. And so the question is even more relevant. The question that we made a few months ago, when we didn't know yet how it was going to progress in this area, is even more relevant, because now that we know that others will be allowed to come in and provide their services, just like the auditors or the accountants, etc., the question about whether the code or the standards should be applicable to the others is even more relevant. Not going to say anything else, but this is just to stress the relevance of the answer to this question. The second is on the enforcement, and this is also out of our control and capacity and competence. So it's not for IESBA, and someone told it here very clearly, to decide how to enforce. This is something that regulators, decision makers, etc., will have to decide if they understand and they consider that the applicability of these standards to the others will be relevant. So this is a very continuously changing context that we will have to capture at all times and make sure that what we are doing as a standard setter fits within the general framework and the general regulatory policy context, etc. So that's it. Thank you very much. It was very good to listen from the CAG how we could adjust our work on sustainability.
Thank you, Gabriela, and thank you, Mark, for this presentation. The CAG will look forward to hearing again from you in the future as this it continues to develop. So with that, we're going to move on to our next topic, which is the technology project. And I think that I don't see him, but I think Rich Huesken, the project chair, is on. Rich, I'll turn the time over to you, and we'll go forward with your presentation.
Okay, so if we can move, get this into slide mode and move to the next slide. What we'd like to do today, and thank you so much for inviting us to join you, is to review with you the results of the comments received on the exposure draft and the proposed further adjustments to the that have made to the proposed standard based on those comments, and of course get your input and thinking. So if we can move to the next slide, you've seen this slide before, but just by virtue of a little bit of background, this project, my slides aren't moving. I don't know if others are moving, but by way of background, as I just refresh, we as we've talked before, the technology project was actually started and the issues paper put out before the important work of the Role and Mindset Project task force and the NAS project were completed. And as you know, some of our issues in our issues papers were addressed by those standards. We also had the 2 global surveys, one on complexity, one on auditor independence. And then, as we've talked before in our prior sessions, there's been extensive outreach. The numbers are in the, somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 to 60 different things we've done. The technology working group has done a huge number of outreaches. Cam's going to talk, Cam Loon's going to join me and talk a little bit about some of the more recent things, and then and help me with the presentation today. But also, besides the results from the comment letter process, we certainly took into consideration and appreciated the feedback that this group gave us in September of 2021, right before we finalized the ED in December. And certainly we have been mindful of the public interest points from the PIOB, and as well as the helpful comments made at the board meetings from the PIOB representatives. So with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Cam, who is the senior project member from the task force. As you know, as we move towards the monitoring group implementation, we are moving towards a staff-led model. And so as part of the September board meeting, and I've done this here, the staff have been helping in some cases make the presentations and address the questions. And so Cam has been kind enough to agree to help follow that model here with you all today. So Cam, if you want to talk about the webcast we held first and go from there. We can move to the next slide.
Thank you, Rich. So after the exposure draft was issued on February 20th, and as you can see here in between with a comment letter deadline of June 20. So in between February and June, the task force did present the ED proposals at various stakeholder webinars or meetings, and also took questions from stakeholders in Malaysia, Europe, and South Africa, just to name a few. Global webinar, as Rich just mentioned, was also held in April, which is recorded and available on the website. There was a live Q&A there. As you can see, a mix of stakeholder groups attended the webinar. So this included those from oversight bodies, those charged with governance, preparers, and as well as investors. So next slide, please. So the 50 comment letters were received, and In terms of geographically, this represented a range of regions as well as stakeholder groups. Stakeholder groups such as regulatory bodies and as well as in the line for others that you can see over there. That also included the Small and Medium Practitioners Advisory Group and also including from a technologist perspective, so an AI software developer. Next slide, please. So on balance, after the task force reviewed all the comment letters and analyzed all the comments, clear support for the ED proposals were noted. There were many helpful suggestions as to how to refine further drafting or some highlights of areas where further clarification could be provided. So 6 significant issues were identified by the task force. And these will impact how the revisions to the ED will be finalized and progress. So we're just going to take them one at a time here. Next slide, please. So on the first significant issue, the exposure draft proposed the addition of examples of professional skills needed in the digital age. So this included specifically interpersonal communication and organizational skills. So support was noted for this addition, but there were various concerns that were highlighted in the comment letters. So this included whether the explicit calling out of these soft skills are relevant in an ethics code and whether a lack of such skills would mean an ethical violation. There was a view by one commentator that there could be a misconception that PAs need to be extroverts when complying with the code. And there was also a view that the addition was generic and potentially could create an inadvertent barrier into the profession with a possible discriminatory effect, in particular for neurodiverse individuals. It was also noted that these soft skills per se have always been needed even before technology, and so it's not exactly technology specific. There are also a number of suggestions to further enhance the guidance, and that's really to recognize that these soft skills that a PA should possess, and it should be clarified that it will depend on the role and the capacity of the PA and the type of service that they're performing. There was also suggestions to add other digital skills. So for example, innovative thought leadership, adaptability, responsiveness, etc. So I'm just going to pass it on to Rich now, and next slide, please.
Thanks, Cam. And so you can see here some of the response that the task force developed in response to the comment process, and in particular, you'll note that we deleted the part B of the first paragraph, particularly some sensitivity that was expressed by respondents about the phrase requires there, and then created new application material that addresses the concept that the knowledge and the skills can vary depending on what's being undertaken, that that interpersonal communication and organizational skills are now given examples of things, of skills, and that's not necessarily a complete list. And then finally, that it can be important in the exercise of assessment of professional competence and exercise of due care, that a level of knowledge on technology and its operations can be necessary. And then to build off of that on the next slide, we added some revisions that clarifies further in 113.1A3 that the skills needed will be dependent on the type of services the professional accountant is providing. And so with that, we believe those were responsive to the comments that were received in this. So Cam, do you want to take us to confidential information?
Yes, thanks, Rich. So next slide, please. Yeah, thank you. So the exposure draft also included an explicit prompt for PAs to secure confidential information over the entire data governance cycle, and also introduced a new definition of confidential information in the glossary. So that's essentially information that is not in the public domain. There was broad support for these new materials and various suggestions for further guidance and clarification. So this included suggestions to include an example or clarify whether it is appropriate for PAs to seek consent to share anonymized confidential information for the purposes of developing new technology, where appropriate safeguards are in place. So this specific commentator raised it in the context of AI training. And if the CAG representatives recall, this was also aligned with the technology working group's recommendation A in their draft final phase 2 report presented earlier in September. There were also calls to explicitly emphasize PA's obligation to comply with the requirements of confidentiality, even if there has been improper disclosure by others. And also further clarity requested on what is expected of a PA in terms of securing confidential information. And with that a view that the term secure, it could be quite broadly interpreted. With respect to the new definition, further clarity on the term public domain was requested, and that's because it was observed that this term is often associated with material that's no longer protected by copyright, and concern that potentially this could be confusing to users of the code. Finally, there was also calls to include additional guidance to consider the complexities arising from multi-jurisdictional laws and regulations that cover confidential information, including privacy. So I'll pass it back to Rich to take us through the responses.
Sure, if we could go to the next slide. So there was a lot of comments and there's a lot of topics there, I should say. So we're going to go through those one by one. So first off, one of the things Cam mentioned was there were commenters wanted something to address situations where the PA was in possession of confidential information, but it became publicly available from some other disclosure source. And many times that could be an unauthorized or improper disclosure. And so we've added a subparagraph H to R114.1 to address that very specifically there, as shown on this slide. With that then, if you can move to the next slide, we also have adjusted this description of maintaining confidentiality over the data governance lifecycle in two ways. One, many commentators suggested secure was not the right word, and so that's been modified to protect the confidentiality of such information, and then inserted the word retention, which was viewed at least by some commentators to be an important element of the data governance lifecycle, and so those revisions are made there. And then the next slide, please, 114.1A3 takes into consideration the first part at the top, while the words are just changing or use. That really is going to relate to something I'm going to cover in just a second on the next slide, but sets us up for when confidential information is used with permission, for example, in the case of artificial intelligence. The second change on this slide relates to the inclusion of a reference specifically to depends on circumstances, including the application of law or regulation, including those governing privacy and where disclosures might take place. And that's consistent with how the code in general handles all matters related to law and regulation, that you follow the code, but you also have to follow what is the applicable law and regulation. If we could go to the next slide. This is a fairly important addition here in response to what was widely recognized, and that data is being used, confidential information is being used with consent for purposes such as training, development, research and development, and machine learning purposes, and that perhaps we should address that in terms of some specific considerations that need to be taken into case for that to be appropriate. This also resolves the technology working groups. One of their 10 recommendations is addressed, and they will note that in their final report by this provision here, where we've put these factors in that provide some oversight or guidance on what you need to do about what you need to disclose to to the owner of the information prior to getting their consent to use it. So what is the information is, what you're going to, the purpose for which you're requesting it and using it, and then certainly information about the identity of any individual entities or entities which information relates will be identifiable, will be sufficiently anonymized to not be identifiable. So those are key points in response to the survey. If we could, I think with that, Cam, we want one more thing. Move to the next slide to cover the definitional change, and one more beyond that, please. Okay, so it was pointed out that the use of the word public domain had some potential conflicts with how that is defined in certain in the concept of intellectual property rights and software, including open source software. And so to be consistent with how it's used elsewhere in the code, and how we made some changes earlier on this that you saw in one of the earlier slides, we're saying it is not publicly available. So any information, data, or other material in whatever form or medium, including written, electronic, visual, or oral, that is not publicly available is now what the definition is going to read as. So with that, we're going to switch to the next significant point, which is of comment, which was on the complex circumstances section of the exposure draft. Cam?
Yeah. So thank you, Rich. So the exposure draft proposed guidance to explain the relevant facts and circumstances that give rise to complex circumstances. And it also included guidance on how a PA might manage this challenge from complexity. So support was mixed for these proposals. In particular, some respondents questioned whether this guidance is necessary in the code. And that's really because there was the view that whether or not circumstances are complex or complicated, a PA needs to comply with the fundamental principle of professional competence and due care, and that in doing so, this would not change the threats and safeguards approach of the code. Some respondents commented that the guidance was vague and overly general in this context. And also it was pointed out that the concept of complexity should be aligned with how it's addressed in the ISA 315, identifying and assessing the risk of material misstatements. So in that ISA, it includes complexity as one of the inherent risk factors. So aligning the conceptual definition of that would then encourage a greater degree of convergence and practical application. Other key comments included suggestions, on the other hand, to relocate the notion of complexity as a factor to be considered within the conceptual framework, so either in evaluating threats or into application material for considering changes in facts and circumstances. There was also suggestions to incorporate technology-specific examples of complex matters, and in this regard, it was pointed out that the examples provided in the explanatory memorandum of the ED would be helpful to be included. And also if the specific paragraphs on complexity were retained as is, to really develop more non-authoritative material to explain how this guidance would be applied in practice. So on to you, Rich.
Sure. So in light of those, we the task force did consider the comments about whether you should just take out the complex circumstances, and there are points of view that indicate that complex circumstances can exist across a broad spectrum. Doesn't have to, it isn't unique to technology, but it was felt that in light of the 82% response in the survey asking for something in this regard, that it was appropriate to put it in there. But we did, and I think this is a helpful change, we did move it from its own section to putting it into the application material related to exercising professional judgment in complying with the code. And I think that is a helpful move there. And you can see it adopts the concept that it's a more simplified wording, but it makes it clear that it could be across a variety variety of situations, and it can vary considerably. And we had expressed that point of view in the explanatory memorandum that Cam was referring to. So if we could move to the next slide, then we did have factors that we do consider or believe needs to be considered in addressing complexity. And those factors are relatively largely unchanged, with the exception of adding that first bullet where, with the help of comments from parties, it was felt that putting something in around the analysis and investigating as relevant the uncertain elements, the multiple variables and assumptions, and how they are connected or interdependent was important to add. And then you'll notice the next to last bullet point, while it appears to be minor wording changes, there was a view that monitoring was not the right way to describe this in terms of the exercise of professional judgment, but thus bringing about the phrase being alert to any developments or changes in the facts and circumstances, and of course any impact that might have on judgments. So those were the responsive changes to the comments on complex circumstances. With that, perhaps we can move to the topic of identifying threats when relying on the output from technology. Cam?
Yeah, thanks, Rich. So the exposure draft introduced considerations to help in identifying threats that might arise when a PA relies upon the output of technology. There was general support for this. However, there were a number of questions and requests for clarifications, in particular for two of the considerations. You can probably see those on your screen right now. The first one is whether or not technology incorporates the expertise or judgments of the accountant or its employing organization or firm. In this regard, the questions that were raised was what does the expertise and judgment relate to? So for example, is it the PA's judgment and expertise in setting the parameters to use the technology, or is it really the PA's professional judgment when performing the service, which would mean with or without technology? And in respect to the second bullet on professional competence of the PA to use and explain the output of technology, it was questioned whether it was reasonable to expect a PA to already have that sufficient expertise or understanding with respect to the technology, and many suggestions to include the access to an expert who could help the PA obtain that sufficient expertise to use and understand the technology. So other drafting suggestions included that the consideration should be linked to the specific threats to compliance with the fundamental principles. So that would be in line with the preceding paragraph in the extant code. And also to add a subheading to clarify that these are specific threats in relation to the use of technology, and also helpful suggestions for a number of other additional considerations to be added. So for example, the data, sufficiency of data quality, programming underpinning the technology, the sophistication and maturity of the technology, and a question about whether or not documentation should be considered. There was also a suggestion to add safeguards to address the threats. For example, this commentator provided an example in relation to obtaining third-party certifications, and also a suggestion to add guidance on specific issues to be considered by PAs, such as training of AI systems. So turning it back to Rich.
Sure, if we could change the slides, please. So we did put in the subheading that you saw referenced on the prior page, and then reorganize the threats, including adding factors around consideration of data inputs, and the point that Cam referenced about access to an expert on use or understanding or explaining the output of the technology are a couple of the key points that have been changed here. As you note, most of these were present as a factor, but we've organized them under the type of threats that they relate to. And then if we could go to the next slide, please. This is a fairly, this is all new application material. It was developed to provide examples of where the PAs evaluation of the level of threat associated with the use of technology might be impacted by their employing organization or work environment, and factors that could weigh in on that, including the degree of corporate oversight, the degree of internal controls and the existence of those, whether there are third-party assessments of the quality and functionality of the technology, and the relevant training that may have been provided to employees. And by the way, corresponding adjustments have been made in section 300 as it relates to these kinds of concepts, as it might relate to professional accountants in public practice. And that was, again, to be more responsive to the comment respondents asking for some examples. So with that, we've talked about assessing the threats from use or reliance of technology. The next topic relates to the concept of when you're using the output of the technology. And we initially had that combined with relying on the work of others. And as Cam's going to explain on this next slide, there was some thoughtful comments in that regard.
Thanks, Rich. So in terms of using the output of technology, the exposure draft introduced a number of factors for a PA to consider whether it's reasonable to do so. One, as Rich just mentioned, one very helpful comment was that these factors should be relocated to a separate discrete section from using the work of an expert, as it's essentially conceptually different, the use of the output of technology. So this has been taken into account by the task force. Another comment was that the focus of these factors should not only be on the output of technology, but rather the whole process for making the use of this of technology. And Rich will explain in a little bit how the task force, with the task force thinking on that. There was also a number of clarifications and suggestions for the incorporation of additional factors. So that's including whether appropriate or effective ITGC controls are in place. So including user access and user management control. And also there was in the ED, there was a bullet on a factor on assessing the reputation of the software developer and questions on how a PA should do this, because there was a view that assessing the reputation of a software developer might actually be quite subjective, and in particular for emerging technologies where potentially the reputation is not yet stable, if you may. There was also a request to further emphasize the accountability of PAs, which was seen as particularly relevant as AI with AI automated decision making. And so this commentator suggested to add a reference to decisions made by individuals relating to the operation of the technology. So Rich, on to you.
Sure. So if we can go to the next slide. So this is the lead-in paragraph when we separated using the output of technology from using the work of an expert. And it clearly sets forth the obligation, the requirement that whether it was developed internally or by a third party, that PA
coming out for y'all. Other people don't matter. I get this energy of some of you are just so guarded and cold, but it's okay for you to make new connections. I think you're safe to make new connections.
We need somebody to put their mic on mute. Sorry about that, Rich.
No, not at all. So this is simply to set the requirement that you need to exercise professional judgment in the use of the output of technology. And then if we could go to the next slide, there's a series of changes we made here, focusing some key points would be that the employee and organization or firm's oversight of the design and the development and the implementation of that technology, and then over its operation, maintenance, monitoring, updating, and upgrading of the technology, essentially to cover the entire life cycle or process. The controls might exist over the use of the technology, including controls around user access, are things that factors that have to be considered. when you intend to use the technology. And then there was a very helpful comments that the phrase prior experience and general acceptance that we had used in the ED was perhaps fairly broad and difficult to deal with. And so you see where we've eliminated the fourth bullet point, but then in the sixth bullet point, I'm sorry, the concept that whether the technology is established and effective for the purpose is a little broad, but the sixth bullet point now has been added to say prior experience with the technology and whether its use for a specific purpose is generally accepted. That was believed that was a better way to approach this than what we had in the fourth bullet point from the comments received. And then of course, how a firm or an employee organization exercises oversight for in-house versus third-party technology will differ given the facts and circumstances, and those differences aren't limited to technology. It is acknowledged here in these factors. So with that, go one more slide, please. Then we also made some minor adjustments really to be consistent, as I referenced before, with the phrase to use the work of others or the output of technology, and to simplify the phrasing around consideration when whether the accountant is in a position within the employee organization to obtain information, et cetera, as opposed to saying impacts the ability. So with each of those responsive to comments, with that, we're going to move now to out of the ethics section and move into the part 4A to the independence aspects of our proposal here. So Cam, do you want to tee up the business relationships, close business relationships, please?
Yeah, thanks, Rich. The exposure draft introduced an example of a close business relationship arising from the provision of technology. So specifically, this was the joint development of a product or solution by a firm and its client. There was broad support for the inclusion of this example and also suggestions to include others. So for example, the products or solutions related to technology where one or both of the parties use it for their internal purposes. Suggestions that the specific example included in the explanatory memorandum to the ED, which is sub-bullet A and B that you see on your screen right there. It should be included into the code as an example, and also calls to include a definition, a more general definition of what a close business relationship is, as clearly you can't add all the examples into a code. So back to you, Rich.
Sure. If we go to the next slide. So in response to those, one of the concerns was that that we were not trying to say that every situation was the same and created a close business relationship. And so we've added some new application material that talks about, when you have an arrangement with a firm or a network firm licenses products or solutions to or from a client, that it might create a close business relationship. And so that the point is one has to understand the facts and circumstances and assess that. And then if we could move to the next slide, please. Cam's going to now cover a couple other things that came up under this general topic in the ED. So Cam?
Yeah. As Rich mentioned earlier in the presentation, there was a survey conducted on auditor independence, where it was noted that 24% of survey respondents didn't realize that the NAS provisions apply when when there's a licensing arrangement, which is also a close business relationship, but that licensing arrangement performs in NAS. So the exposure draft included a signpost in the section 520, that was in 520.7A1. And this was to prompt firms to consider the relevance of the NAS provisions when technology is sold, resold, or licensed by a firm to an audit client. So this signpost was intended to emphasize that users of the code should consider the the NAS provisions and whether those arrangements are in substance performing a NAS. Respondents were mainly supportive. However, there were a number of concerns and comments, which essentially were around, the signpost was confusing in terms of it might lead users to believe that close business relationship in essence equates to a NAS. And also concerns about whether or not pure reselling, so just a pure pass-through reselling of a product or solution, whether or not that required assessment under Section 600. There was a helpful suggestion to provide additional clarity on the provision of indirect services. So that's really the downstream, further downstream licensing of a product or solution after the initial licensing. So back to you, Rich.
Thanks. So if we look at the next slide, you may recall from our prior discussions, and as Cam referenced, the point here was we wanted to remind people in both 527A1 and then again in 600.6 that when you provided a service, whether you provided it with individual professional resources, whether you provided it exclusively with technology or some combination, you needed to consider, and particularly when technology was involved, whether the technology had elements that would not be permissible under the non-assurance services, non-audit services provisions. And that was simply the intent here. But as Cam indicated, a few people got concerned that it, even though it was application material, it felt a little bit more like a requirement. So we endeavored to reword these to try to make it a little clearer and to pick up the point that in 527A1, that you need to consider the requirements and application material in 600. And then as you can see on the right side of this slide, where we use the phrase resell, we are going to address in our basis for conclusion that a pass-through where you're simply arranging a relationship is not the same as is not clearly not a non-assurance services, but you should always consider the facts and circumstances of what one has agreed to in the contractual terms of the reselling. And then at the bottom of this slide in 606, the point that Cam made, and very importantly, at the bottom there, is that we made it clear that you can, if you're providing technology or software, or you're selling or reselling or licensing that technology to an audit client or to an entity that provides services using such technology to audit clients of the firm, that's the indirect element. So you may provide a service to somebody and then or technology to somebody, and they in turn then either pass it through or use it in providing services to those clients. You do still need to consider in particular the self-review threats concept, but you have to consider the NAS provisions. So it's not saying that per se they are, it simply says you need to take that into consideration. So with that, Cam, do you want to move to the hosting piece?
Yep, and this is our the last significant issue identified by the task force, and this was in relation to hosting. The exposure draft introduced a prohibition on services related to hosting, both directly and indirectly, of audit clients' data. There's broad support for this. However, there were a number of questions and comments and suggestions essentially to clarify the scope of the prohibition. It was viewed as too broad and unclear as to what it covers. So for example, what does indirectly and directly cover? Whether the prohibition actually covers, for example, vendor selection services for a hosting platform, or portals to transfer client data for the completion of a professional service. And so back to you, Rich.
Sure, if we could go to the next slide. So this is the main section on hosting here in 606.3A1. And as you can see, we have moved away from this concept of services in relation to hosting and explicitly stated stores data or manages directly or indirectly the hosting of the data. There had been people during the process of developing the ED who felt that the provide service was the right way to approach it, but it was clear from the comments there was overwhelming support for changing that. And by the way, indirectly, and we will explain this in our basis for conclusion, is simply the concept that you are the one obligated or have agreed to provide, store, or manage that data. The fact that you happen to do it on somebody else's cloud doesn't relieve you of the obligation to comply under 606 with the non-assurance services prohibitions. These obviously are, in this slide, matters that represent the assumption of management responsibility and therefore are prohibited. And they provide in the A, B, and C example, more specific examples of those, as well as the point in the last bullet point that, you know, the operating, maintenance, or monitoring the audit client's IT systems or websites would also be. So the idea is this is broad, and that there are any aspect of hosting would not be permitted under the standard. And then if we could switch the slide one more page. We had created, and we talked with you about this before, that there are situations where the client has their data, they provide it to the professional accountant so that the professional accountant can perform permissible non-assurance services. The easy example to think about there is the client provides its data so that the tax returns can be prepared, but there can be other examples. And we had drafted language in 606-3A2 to provide that exception as permissible. There were some astute comments made that said, gee, the way it was worded, it didn't make it clear it was okay to do that in the course of the audit. And then there was a number of people who said, well, when we do that, we transmit this data via a portal, and is that transmission okay? And so to clarify that, you can see we've included the word transmission, and included the concept both in the course of the audit or the provision of permissible services to address those concepts, which are cases. In each case, the data is the client's. The client provides the data for the services to be performed or the audit to be conducted, and that is not an example, is not what we're considering hosting. So with that, if we could move to the next slide. Those are the 6 significant issues as we can address them from the comments, as well as what we presented to the board last week at the September meeting. We do have a time frame here for you, which is consistent with what we have been following for a while, that we would expect to continue to do some outreach here in the fall with IFIAR and with IOSCO. We would like to have first read of the ED at the task force revisions in the December meeting, and we look to get final CAG advice in March, and hopefully at the March meeting we will issue a final standard. I will say that the feedback from the board was very positive for how the comments from the comment letter process were addressed. And we feel the comments were very helpful to us in getting many of these points clarified, consistent with both our view as a task force and the views of the comment providers. So at this point, Galen, I would pass it over and open it up for reactions, input, feedback, and any assistance that the CAG can give us.
This is our opportunity, folks. You've had a great presentation here, and thank you very much for that, Rich and Cam. So if you will pop your hands up if you have any reactions, and I see Jim Dawkin.
Thanks, Galen, and thank you for the presentation. Hold on. Thank you for that, and thank you for the presentation. One question I wanted to follow up on, and it's sort of a scenario, and I was trying to figure out where that might fit in. And what we're seeing, particularly in the area of public sector, is that an organization or an auditor may develop something, let's say it's a fraud technology or fraud identification technology that works really well for their audit. And so it helps them with their audit. Then ultimately the client says, you know, what you've developed is so good, we want to use that for our own management of identifying fraud. And so that ends up creating some tension because it's a auditor prepared, you call it software program, auditor prepared tool that is being requested by management, and then arguably the organization or the auditor is standing in the shoes of management in effect. And you went through a bunch of interesting topics about closeness. I just wasn't quite sure if that neatly fit in any one of those, or I just wanted to raise that comment because it's a pretty substantial issue that we see.
Rich, would you like to field that one?
And James, I agree. That is something we are aware of as task force, and I think those of us in practice have seen that. And unfortunately, the answer is, in my mind, and I think the standard does it already. Keep in mind that what we're doing here with this standard, I want to mention one thing, is the NAS standard already said that activities that involve the accounting records, the financial statements, or the internal control over financial reporting that might create a self-review threat are prohibited for PIs. And what we've really done is, in that they describe that in 606 as information system services. We've expanded and explained what is meant by the broad scope of information system services, besides addressing the hosting issue. And so, Jim, I think then, fortunately, on two fronts, you mentioned the one, you could essentially step in and be taking over a management responsibility when you move from using the tool as an audit tool to providing it to the client for their purposes of fitting into their management and monitoring of risks. And secondly, you're going to clearly probably move into the space of the self-review threat, because you would be the one, you would be testing the work that came from a system you produced. And so that's, I think, consistent with some of the things that we have that's already in the code, but that's certainly consistent with what we're saying about in 520 as well as in 606, that would not be permissible.
Thank you, Rich. I see Akihito.
Thank you, Galen. Rich, thank you very much for your great presentation. In order to address the stakeholders' needs and respond to the rapid development of technology, I think it is important to develop and publish useful guidance for practitioners considering various kind of technology, timely and continuously. As an overall comment regarding the revision of Part 2 of the code, there is possibility for small and medium-sized entity SMEs to face the implementation challenges or unintended consequences due to resource or cost constraints. So it is important to conduct sufficient outreaches also to SMEs. I think scalability is one of the key consideration matters in standard setting, I believe. That's my comment. Thank you.
Yeah.
I don't see any other hands. Rich, would you like to
comment
on that one?
Yeah, Akihito, I agree. We had we didn't show it on these slides, but we had an extensive session with the small and medium practitioners working group to talk through the scalability of this as it relates to the provisions in 606 regarding self-interest threat. To the extent that the entities involved are not PIs, there is not the absolute prohibition around the self-review threat that there is for PIs. There is the continues to be consistent with the rest of the non-audit services section of the code, the opportunity to assess the level of the threats and determine whether appropriate safeguards, and there are safeguards in the code in those areas, can be applied to reduce that to an acceptable level. And in fact, it was not one of the significant issues, but we did take comments on and make some adjustments, largely from our feedback from SMP working group, as well as other SMP commenters on the section on routine and mechanical, to help clarify what we were after, where we were really saying, look, if it involves your judgment as a firm that's in the technology, where you've created the technology and how it works, then that's something it may not be able to overcome that. But on the other hand, some of the things that are just routine and mechanical implementation for small and medium-sized firms that are not PIs, it was still recognized, I think, by the task force and the board, that the safeguards approach made sense. And then I would also, Akihito, comment on the business relationship. That was part of why we made some of the adjustments to try to clarify this point about might create a business relationship. We're aware that small and medium practitioners, often with small and medium-sized enterprises, can often be the connection point between a third-party software provider and the need of that client or of that company for the kinds of software that the provider has. And that's what I mean by that kind of pass-through approach, where you're really just connecting the parties together. And there can be a couple of different ways that's done in the practice, but the point there that we're going to clarify in the basis for conclusion is that doesn't necessarily constitute a non-assurance service that's prohibited, but that in fact that's really just a facilitation arrangement to bring parties together. So and oftentimes the professional accountant is no longer involved in the arrangement between the software provider and the company after the initial introduction and either sale or resale.
Rich, I don't see any other hands up. I would just like to say that I'm really pleased to see how this has been evolving and moving forward. I like what I hear on the hosting. That's been an issue that's popped up over and again for quite some time. So thank you for that. Quite some time ago on the presentation, when you were talking about confidentiality, and I think we discussed it at the board meeting on AI and benchmarking, I think the point was raised about anonymization, that can be a real challenge with the ability of computers to delve into data and be able to determine where it came from or who it belongs to. And so being able to make that confidential is, I think, a real challenge. In that respect, about, quite some time ago, the AICPA and their ethics group, they took on a benchmarking project, and they have that out there. It might be worthwhile to see what they ended up with in their standard on that. And then I think the other issue that I believe I raised it in the board meeting was about NOCLAR, and maybe the possibility of saying, hey, nothing here that we've said on confidentiality really applies in a situation involving suspected non-compliance with laws or regulations. I don't see any other hands. I don't know if you'd like to respond to those that I just made rich, but then maybe we can hear from Dave and Gabriela if they have anything on this.
So very briefly, we have had some discussions with the AICPA, and we're going to have some further discussions with them. But I think that was helped inform us on what we were trying to do with 114.1A4, in that you need to, benchmarking is one of those places it's used. And frankly, to me personally, that's where I'm a little more concerned about the anonymization, because if you happen to be dealing with entities that stand out in some unique way, it can be hard to anonymize that data. And I think that's why it's important that in those points A through D in that section, things you have to specifically address in getting consent with the owner of the data, I think will help keep people focused on how that's going to be accomplished. And then on the NOCLAR, I do recall that from the meeting, and I think we did note that we tried to, in the confidentiality piece, address that point about that under the section on addressing whether any applicable law or regulation includes those governing privacy jurisdiction has to be considered. But I think let me take that back to the task force. I understand your point about making a perhaps an even more direct connection there.
With that, Dave, would you like to weigh in?
Great, thanks, Galen. First of all, Rich, thanks to you and Cam for the presentation. I thought it was very meaningful and detailed. I believe that the responses and the edits that you've described are clarifying and strengthening the provisions of the code, especially those related to non-audit services. And so I'm really supportive of what you've done there, and want to commend you on the collaboration with the other working groups, because that coordination obviously is key, and there's a lot to learn from one another. Just one specific comment I'd make, and it's really more just of an issue of mine, but I think it was when you were talking about the consents on confidential information that you indicated that the way the edit was worded is that would preferably be in writing, quote unquote, I think. And I love evidence, so I think having it in writing is about the only way you can prove that both parties had access to what was intended, and that that becomes really important, not just audit evidence, but it's important years down the road probably. So just a comment.
Okay, well, appreciate that. I believe that came out in one of the board discussions last week too, briefly. So we can, I don't know how you, personally, I don't know how you get a consent evidencing each of these 4 points if it's not in writing. It's kind of my reaction. So
I've got to go with you with
that. Good point.
Yeah. Thank you. That was it.
And Gabriela.
Thank you, Galen. Well, I don't have any specific point. My only point is to highlight the progress that was made in this project, and the importance that it has in terms of making sure that the ethics code remains fit for purpose and does not ignore the developments around us. This is a very difficult topic, because once we will be ready with this project, we know that other developments may be already impacting the standards, and reality is always evolving. So we will not be able at any point in time to say that we are ready, but the progress made and what these changes will mean in terms of updating the code and making sure that the standards are always fit for purpose and useful for the users, and to make and to shape somehow the reality itself. It's very important. So thank you very much for the contribution of the CAG. Once again, you know that we now have a technology experts group that is also advising somehow the IESBA, but that does not exclude, on the contrary, the value of these contributions of different stakeholders from different backgrounds and with different perspectives, which we very much appreciate. So thank you very much, and thank you, Rich, for the excellent work done. I think that I'm very optimistic about the end of this project, because it progressed so well in since the last time that we talked, that I think that we should be optimistic about where we will land and how robust these standards will be. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriela, and thank you, Rich and Cam, for your presentation. With that, we're due for a break. Why don't we break until 30 minutes after the hour, and then we'll come back and have a discussion on the strategy and work plan for the forthcoming years. So we're on break now, okay? Carla, it's a little bit hard to tell whether everyone is back yet, but it looks like people are popping back up as far as their screens are concerned.
Yes, Galen, I think we're 10:30 on the hour.
Okay.
If I may check. Gabriela,
Why don't we?
We're just waiting for Gabriela. Perhaps she might make some opening remarks to the.
While we're waiting
Oh,
for you.
Oh,
there she is.
Yes,
okay. So I might in introducing this next section, one of the most important things that the CAG can do, in my opinion, is weigh in on the future strategy of where the board is going with projects and their efforts down the road. And that is the topic that we're on for the next hour. And I guess we're gonna have Gabriela and Ken Seong, senior technical advisor from staff, I believe, is going to make the presentation. Am I correct on that?
I will probably replace Ken
okay.
on this one, Gail.
Okay,
that's correct. Okay.
And maybe my first question before you get started is why 4 years? Didn't we used to do 5?
We want to line up with IESBA as well, so they're changing theirs. So they're moving it for 24 to 27. So the two SSBs will absolutely aligned in terms of their plans and the timing of the next strategy period. But Ken's going to come in as well.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. And yeah, absolutely. The one of the reasons is really to make sure that we can be coordinated a bit more closely with our sister board on the IESBA, which has a 4-year strategy cycle. That makes a lot of sense. And secondly, we do find that a 5-year period in the context of all the changes we are experiencing in terms of business environment and the changes to the work of professional accountants and so forth, that 5 years is a long time as we look forward to future strategies. So perhaps Darling is slightly back. Perhaps it helps us get a better balance in terms of really focusing on the latest changes and being able to be as responsive as possible to the market needs.
Well, you folks have the floor, so I don't know how you want to proceed.
If I may just like to say a few words before I give the floor to Geoff, who will present, will make this presentation. And the first thing would probably be to follow up on what Ken just said, that 5 years is a long period. 4 is also a long period, and also when it begins from some time now. And what I'd like to stress, and I think that I mentioned that in my first meeting with this consultative and advisory group, is that we will have to remain flexible. And this is something that the board has already incorporated, is that, of course, we have to plan. Of course, we have to try to understand where we are more useful and which are the main trends that are driving our strategy and our work plan. But we also have to be aware that a few things may change. I would say will most certainly change over the next 4 or 5 years, and that we may have to adapt this strategy and work plan accordingly. What we certainly don't want is to be a standard setter that is unaware of the context where it operates and of the trends and needs that are out there in the market and in the community. First thing. Second thing, we had a very productive and interesting discussion at the board meeting about the strategy and work plan. We are now at a critical juncture in this planning of our future life. While we are analyzing the answers that we received, we are also still listening to everybody. This work hasn't stopped, and so the insights and the contributions that our stakeholders, which are so well and so highly represented at this consultative and advisory group, are very welcome and will be very welcome on the next few months while we build upon these answers and these contributions to try to set up the best and the most appropriate strategy and work plan for the future. So I just wanted to share that we really value this dialogue with our stakeholders, and that this is one of the most critical topics where we really need your input and your views. What we got from the stakeholders that responded to the survey was a confirmation, if I may say that our intuition that some areas should be should be prioritized or should be subject to a special attention on our side. Some of them in a more consistent and convergent way, others with slightly different answers, like on independence of auditors. But I think that we may say that it was confirmed that we should go along the way that we had planned. But Geoff will let you know better about what we heard and about our own reflections about what we heard, and then hear from you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Gabriela, and thanks, Galen. And of course, Gabriela and Cam will jump in as necessary. And so certainly appreciate the opportunity to share with the CAG today where we're at with the development of our next strategy and work plan. And as Galen has mentioned, that's for the years 24 to 27. So I will walk you through today some of the key responses we've got back from the survey that we sent out in April, and the PC our planning, IESBA's planning committee's analysis and the board's discussion last week. So we could go to the next slide. Thanks, China. And of course, we would love to get your input on the responses and on the IESBA's discussions. And as Galen has mentioned, we really value the CAG strategic input on all our work, and no doubt particularly with what we are going to do from 24 to 27. So we go to the next slide. Thanks, Diana. Just very quickly, just a little bit of a recap where we're at and what we've done so far. The next strategy and work plan, as part of our due process, we go through public consultation first with our survey, but also, as you might know, and as this diagram has indicated, we will have a consultation paper that we are anticipating will go out in April or March, April next year. And like all our work, we will coordinate very closely with IESBA, and you would know that IESBA is also looking at, it has been working on the consultation paper, and we have been working very closely with them on this. So as we develop, not only the consultation paper, but the strategy and work plan, there's a few things that the board will look at, ongoing projects, any pre-commitments that will extend beyond this work period, and any ongoing board discussions. But we will also look at the monitoring group recommendations. Particularly, we will look at the staffing model. As you know, that we are in the change environment as well, and in the next few years, we will progressively move into the new business model, and so we'll take that into consideration, particularly in terms of resource and those sort of matters. So we can move to the next slide. Thanks, Diana. A quick recap on the survey itself, and first want to thank you for those who provided feedback to us back in March this year as we were developing the survey, and you gave some very valuable feedback to the draft survey, to some of the strategic focus areas, and also to topics that we were going to put into the survey. So thank you those, and your comments had been taken into consideration by the planning committee, but also by the board as we developed the survey that was eventually sent out in April. So in the survey, we have put out 4 potential areas of focus that will help guide IESBA's direction and priorities. The first one that you have already heard this morning from Mark, which is relating to sustainability reporting and assurance. The second area of focus that we are looking at focusing on in the next strategy period is raising the ethical bar of professional accountants in business, so raising the ethical bar for PAIBs. And the third one is continue to strengthen the independent standards for audit engagements. And then the last one is on adoption and implementation, so promoting timely adoption and effective implementation of the IESBA code. If I can move to the next slide. So you'll notice that we have in the survey, we have produced 10 topics. These are potential topics and initiatives that we've asked respondents to provide feedback and give us, I guess, an indicative rating of what they consider to be, the most important projects. So we asked them to rate it from 1 to 5 being the most important, and we've asked them to look at a couple of criteria as they rate them. And so I won't go through them here, but we'll have a chance to perhaps just we will discuss this a bit later part of the presentation in terms of how the respondents voted and the other feedbacks from them as well. If I can go to the next slide, please. Just a very, I guess, quick summary of the responses, or in terms of the respondents, I should say, we've received just under 50 responses. We have 2 monitoring group members responded, IOSCO and IFIA regulators, and many of them are from firms and PAOs. And also I want to especially thank you those CAG member organizations that have responded to the survey. And we also appreciated those that we caught up with in April, Gabriela, myself, and the Andrews. Our other IESBA Director went to Washington, D.C. In September, and we spoke with a few of our CAG members and observers in September as well, and got some feedback from them, amongst other things, our strategic focus for the next period. If we can move to the next slide, please. Thanks, Diana. Just to give you a bit of an overall sense of the responses here. Of the 4 strategic areas of focus, as Gabriela had mentioned already, the response are generally quite positive in terms of those 4 areas of focus. You have heard from Mark about sustainability, reporting and assurance, very strong support for us to move in the direction in terms of looking at standard setting, and really supporting the work of IESBA, of IESBA and also ISSB in terms of creating that comprehensive sort of sustainability reporting and assurance environment, providing that third leg in a sense in terms of ethical behavior and independence. And there's also strong support, as you heard from Mark, for IESBA to explore the concept of expanding the scope of the code. We also have got strong feedback and strong support, or good support from respondents about raising the ethical bar of PAIBs, and also there's a strong acknowledgement about the importance of independent standards and importance of independence, but we do have some mixed views there in terms of the pace of new projects. And again, strong support for adoption and implementation as the strategic focus for 24 to 27. Now, I won't go through the potential projects here, but I will add that we'll look at the analysis a little bit later, and some of you might have had the chance to look at the slide deck earlier. We did receive some additional feedback from IOSCO and IFIA as well. Next slide, please. I guess, just from the outset, just to let the CAG know in terms of developing the draft consultation paper, which we will present to the board for the consideration and discussion in December or November, December. The IESBA's Planning Committee, PC, will consider a number of other things, including today's feedback, but also input. You may recall that our benchmarking working group finalized their report early in the year, so we'll get some input from the working group as well. We have a meeting with the IFAC PIB Advisory Group next week to talk about our strategic focus on PAIBs, but more particularly on sustainability. So that'll be a good opportunity for us to hear from a very important stakeholder group in terms of our strategic focus. We do have a joint IESBA and IESBA Planning Committee meeting coming up in October. Again, it demonstrates the priority we place on coordination, making sure that our strategic focus are aligned, and any areas of mutual interest are being discussed and addressed early on, not when they happen, but as we're in the planning stage. So this is an important aspect for both SSBs. And as Gabriela has mentioned, we haven't stopped receiving information yet, but so we'll continue to hear from our stakeholders in Q4 in Q4 and beyond. So we'll take those into consideration as well. And as I've mentioned, the continuing development of our new SSB business models. Next slide. So the next few moments, I'm going to go into the different strategic focus areas and get your input now. This first one here, we've already discussed quite extensively early on. So I don't intend to continue and go through any of the details which Mark had already gone through. But I do want to just very quickly pause here just in case any CAG representatives might have any additional comments to what was already raised from a strategic focus perspective, not so much from just sustainability reporting and assurance or standard setting. So I'll just pause here very quickly to see if any comments. I don't see any raised hands, which I really weren't expecting any anyway. So perhaps if we can go to the next slide. Thanks, Diana. Okay, so we're going to focus on the next 3 areas of focus, and then we'll get your input about these areas of focus. First, I'll go through the responses and then our planning committee's responses and also the IESBA's discussions. So the first one we've got here is the second area of focus, which is raising the bar of PAIB ethical behavior. So we have general support for this strategic focus. There is a recognition that PAIBs do play a very important role in the financial and sustainability or non-financial reporting supply chain. And there were a few that felt that this focus is not necessary, not because the role of PAIB is not important, but essentially they felt that we have already received some recent revisions relating to Part 2 and Part 1 of the code that are relevant to PAIBs, such as role and mindset and earlier on inducements, and also some revisions to what was Part C of a code, which is now Part 2, on new standards such as pressure. But by and large, there is a strong support on the role of PAIBs and also support for IESBA to continue to focus on setting ethical standards for PAIBs in our code. There were some suggestions for IESBA to conduct further research on the sector before initiating new projects. One suggestion that's come through from some of our commentators is on gaining a better understanding on the new and expanding roles of PAIBs, particularly those that are CFOs or those as in senior roles. We have certainly taken that on board, and this is one of the areas that will also be primarily one of the primary focus of the sustainability working group, or in a few months' time, the task force work is to really look very closely at these new roles from a sustainability reporting perspective. But we will discuss with IFAC PAIB's advisory group next week and beyond and get the feedback. And if we do conduct any research, we will obviously coordinate with them and work with them. There's also some feedback about gaining a better understanding of PAIBs in general, their understanding of the code and the level of PAIBs who are members of IFAC member bodies. Look, these are not new comments. We've heard them before, so we'll certainly take those into consideration. But it is important to understand, of course, that IESBA does not look after the membership side of things. So it's a little outside our remit per se, but as some of you might know, we do work very closely with the IFAC colleagues on a number of areas, including adoption and implementation, and certainly with our colleagues who looks after the PAIB side as well. So we'll continue to work with them on this front. Another comment is support for IESBA to continue monitoring developments and trends in technology. We have found, of course, from this survey, respondents have been continually to ask us to not to stop looking at and monitoring the trend in technology and how it might impact not only PAIBs but those in public practice, but also from an audit perspective or review perspective. So again, I think our respondents have given us a very clear signal that we need to continue to monitor the impact of technology on the ethical and independence standards. Next slide.
Jeff, I do see a hand raised from Harrison. Maybe you'd like to pause here.
Okay, sure. Harrison.
Yes, thank you. It's a very good discussion that we're having regarding to the PAIBs. I guess one thing that strikes me is that I believe that it's good to have a code for PAIBs, but I was looking at if there is a mechanism for enforcement or breaches of the code regarding PAIBs, because I know maybe I'm just missing something someplace, but I know it at least in what I do, we focus more on the external auditors, and we may occasionally come across something that could be a potential violation of the code for a PAIB, but I don't know that there's a real mechanism on a regular basis for checking that. Maybe I'm missing something in all these years.
Hey Harrison, I'm going to interject because I had a somewhat similar observation. I don't want to take too much time here, but CFOs I don't think are regulated in the same way that professional accountants in public practice are, and in fact, you know, a non-PI CFO might not be regulated at all. It's subject to laws and regulations, of course. Well, laws, but and they're not in the same way that someone in public practice. In public practice, if you, for instance, violate the independence standards, if you've impaired independence, your work product will be rejected altogether. You don't have that same. I think that's what you're getting at. The authority that governs them is different, and so in that respect, I wonder whether it should move down a notch and the focus should be more on independence, and not to say that PAIB is not important, but I would probably rank it third, that personally. But I don't want to hang up the discussion there, Jeff, if you want to proceed or if you want to respond to those comments.
No, we'll respond to you definitely, and Ken, feel free to jump in, and then Gabriela as well. I think, Harrison, I don't think you've missed anything. I think your observation is valid, and in terms of holding PAIBs accountable, and in terms of regulatory requirements and supervision, is definitely not nowhere near the same level as those that are placed upon those in public practice and auditors. And in fact, you know, some of the survey responses that is some of the comments that we received is, you know, in terms of compliance by PAIBs, not just with the IESBA code, but if they were members of IFAC member organizations, you know, how do you ensure that they comply with the local standards in terms of requirements that are placed upon them? That is a challenge, and I mean, it's a little outside our remit in terms of compliance. Same as independence, it is you know, a little outside remit, but that's something that you know, we want to continue to work with our IFAC colleague on that one, and you know, hopefully that as we go out and do more outreaches, that would encourage you know, PAIBs to understand and appreciate the importance of complying with a set of ethics standards. But I see Caroline's hand. I'll pass it to Caroline first.
Thanks, Jeff. And thanks, Harrison, for the question. It's a good observation. I guess in the case of PAIBs, it's really the professional accountancy organization of which they are member that would be the avenue for action in the case of disciplinary action. So all the PAOs would have channels for complaints and disciplinary action, investigation and disciplinary action. And I think it is therefore important for the code to continue to have this high expectation and raise the bar for PAIBs, because if we think of the financial reporting ecosystem, they are the starting point. And if they don't get it right at the start and they don't exhibit the right ethical behavior, then it really would put the whole profession at risk, I would say. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. Gabriela?
Thank you, Geoff. My comment is very much along the same lines, but given the fact that you have so well referred, and also Caroline, that first, this is not a regulated profession, namely for CFOs. Secondly, that they have a crucial role in ensuring that the financial and non-financial information and assurance, financial and non-financial reporting are accurate, solid, transparent, etc. They are the first line of defense. They are the ones who are close to the information, and so that are in a more appropriate position to provide this information in appropriate ways. This makes these two things connected, makes our work, the IESBA work, even more important. If we are providing standards for in an area that is so important and at the same time is not regulated, it means that there is actually a room for IESBA to raise the bar and to provide strong standards, which are all in all what they have to guide them through the many dilemmas and questions that the profession and the activity poses.
Thank you, Gabriela. Wami?
Oh, thank you. Thanks for the effort put into developing the strategy and thanks for the presentation. I support that it is the time to focus on the culture and ethical values of professional accountancy in business. Investor protection starts from the source of financial information. PIBs should be held to the same public interest mandate as auditors, and it is important to establish the right culture and independence mindset to ensure investors are protected from the point at which the information is sourced. So I support raising the bar. This is my first comment. And secondly, I would like to go back to the sustainability reporting. Sorry, I did not raise my hand as quickly as just a moment ago. Very quick. I would like to express the support IESBA to focus strategically on developments in sustainability reporting and assurance during its next strategy period. Given that sustainability reporting standards are currently being developed by different standard setters around the globe, that will require accounting and audit input. It is essential that IESBA incorporates sustainability reporting in its work. So the developments in this area are moving rapidly, and IESBA should engage with those developments to determine how they may impact the code. That's all. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Wami. Ken, did you want to come in?
Yeah, very briefly, Jeff, in addition to the comments from yourself, Gabriela and Caroline, I just want to perhaps maybe just highlight again that the accountancy profession derives a lot of its appeal and value on the basis of a very strong ethical base. And the code of ethics that IESBA develops for the accountancy profession provides that strong base and appeal to entrance to the profession. And many professional accountants do take a lot of pride from the very high reputation in which the profession is held among stakeholders and the wider public. It is an important message that we have to bear in mind and be able to convey, because we hear time and again from our stakeholders as we engage with them that we're not doing enough. We're not doing enough to speak about the important role that the code of ethics is playing and can further play. And it is important for us to continue to raise that visibility. The point about regulation is important because clearly accountants in business are not in the same sandbox as auditors. The audit profession is a very highly regulated profession. It is subject to very, very close scrutiny, regulatory inspections, and so forth. So that is an entirely different ballgame. As far as PIBs are concerned, there are different avenues to really raise awareness and encourage PIBs to continue to understand their ethical responsibilities under the code. And for one, the PAOs, the professional accountancy organizations, have a tremendously important role to play in really reaching out to their members in business to really reinforce that message and indeed take whatever actions are necessary. And I, for one, know, because I do belong to one of the PAOs myself, that action is being taken to elevate expectations for continuing professional development. And many of the PAOs are very conscious that there have been concerns amongst the regulatory community, not so much that, as I said, the PIBs are regulated per se, but there have been concerns about whether enough is being done on the preparer side to remind PIBs that if they have important responsibilities under the code. So it is incumbent upon us as people who represent IESBA to engage with the PAOs. Jeff mentioned that we're meeting with the IFAC PIB Advisory Group next week, and we will take that message back to them and continue to interact with them and see how best to really continue to elevate the bar, as Wan Meng said. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you, Ken. I will also add that along the lines of the role of PAOs, I know that many of the PAOs will conduct seminars particularly for the PIB's communities, and often IESBA members or TAs or staff will attend, participate as presenters or panelists, and as I understand, these are generally quite well attended and well received. So I think it's a good indicator that our PAOs are working hard to make sure not only they have a high standard, but also our PIB communities understand the importance of these standards and are complying with them, irrespective of the level of regulations over them. But very good point.
I don't know if Gabrielle wanted to come back in or not. Gabrielle, you still have your hand raised. Okay, you're shaking your head. Let me just follow. I don't disagree with anything that I heard. The only thing is I think CFOs and senior financial people don't necessarily have to. It's voluntary to belong to a PAO in most countries. But I think the biggest argument to really have this as a focus area is because a lot of the problems with failed audits, failed companies really are at the root cause have been with senior financial individuals, CFOs and controllers in particular, that have made adjustments to financial statements that were inappropriate. And from that standpoint, I do really support the focus. Thank you, Jeff.
And as you know, we do have a strong focus on having the right culture, and it's in our code. And I think some of these failures is about making sure that there is that right culture, and that our professional accountants, PIBs, in this instance, are bringing in that culture to their organizations. But let's continue on, and thank you, Harrison, for that initial question. And Wai Ming as well, thank you for your additional comments about sustainability. And I understand that some of the working group members are still on the call, so they will certainly bring it back to the working group. Just very quickly, a few other additional comments. First one about mindful the differences between PIBs in senior and junior roles. A lot of comments is really about perhaps some of the new challenges, that are ethical challenges that are faced by particularly CFOs as they tackle sustainability reporting. But there are also other comments. For instance, some have mentioned that perhaps with the development in AI, CFOs and those in senior roles in the future may be put into the position where they have to decide to replace human employees with AIs and some of the ethical challenges that might come with it. So it's just a comment there, and the board recognized that. And as I've mentioned, next week we'll talk to the PAIB advisory group from IFAC, and particularly from the perspective of sustainability, and we want to get a better understanding, what are some of these key challenges that CFOs are facing. And we've already heard here today, PAIB should be held at a comparable level of ethical standards as PAPPs, those in public practice. Now, this the board last week had spent a bit of time talking about this because there were one or two comments from the respondents and some anecdotal information about some accountants potentially might not want to join a local member organization because they felt that they then might be subject to certain ethics standards that they don't want to be bound by. Whilst there's only a few comments, but I think the board really took that and kind of and certainly in the discussions, there's a strong recognition of the importance of having high standards for high ethical standards for PIBs. As some of those points that Galen's mentioned is, they are in the front line for financial or non-financial reporting, and it is important that they hold to a high level of ethical standards, not necessarily just going higher and higher all the time, but making sure that they are at the right level. So the IESBA, the board last week certainly took this point, at heart and really agreeing that they should hold to a high level of ethics standards. There's a couple of other points about responsibilities over fraud in light of financial crime, and also the effectiveness of some of the no-CLAR provisions. So a few have highlighted the challenges that they may face when it comes to complying with no-CLAR, also noting that their colleagues within the same organization not subject to the same perhaps ethics requirements. The board acknowledged these, but also recognized that we do have a post-implementation review on our no-CLAR provisions that will commence next year. So some of these issues will be looked at when we're going through the post-implementation review. And the last point is development of NAM, sorry about the acronym, is a non-authoritative material to assist PIBs in the understanding of the code and also to raise awareness of the code. Now, you will see a bit later in terms of the strategic focus, adoption, implementation, and also one, NAMs rate very high from respondents' perspective in terms of IESBA putting resource on that. So that's not just for PIBs. Next slide, please. The PC's response and the IESBA's discussions, I've covered all of this already in our earlier discussion. So perhaps if we can move to the next slide, and I'll stop here, pause here, and see if any CAG representatives have any comments about continuing our focus on raising the bar of PIB ethical behavior.
Jeff, I don't see any hands. I think we're fine. Well, Hilda's.
Thank you. A very quick comment. It may be my lack of English, but not sure what raising the bar means, because we don't think that the starting point is that what is there already for PIABs is broken. And we hope that's not where you're starting from as a starting point. So, for instance, where we see there is need to have a much better application is on NOCLAR by PIABs. That's something which is not going well at all. So it's one of the subject matters that you had in the previous slide, that we would think that that is a very important one, but also a very difficult one for PIABs to implement, and hopefully that will be what you will be looking at, and what we have already discussed earlier today on sustainability and greenwashing and the work you're doing there. There is a very, very, very important a part of this that is resting with PIAB. So if that's something that is within your attention, that would be very good. The other matters that you mentioned as well, are more corporate governance matters, like on fraud and controls, and what PIABs can have as a role there, and for you to look at, what are the ethical aspects and how can you beef that up. That's where we would believe the focus should best be. Thank you.
Thanks, Edie. That's a very good comment. I will add, it was in the previous slide, and perhaps I just didn't mention that, is that the board has recognized that in terms of raising the bar for PIABs, it's our work on sustainability would take a great part of what we'll be looking at in terms of looking at the the ethics standards for PIABs. We don't think that part 2 was broken in any particular way or have major gaps, and then certainly we when we developed the survey, that wasn't the case, but it's more to recognize the role of PIABs, and therefore the importance of maintaining and making sure that they do hold on to high standards. As you've mentioned, we are looking at a few things already: greenwashing, presentation and preparation of information, and as Mark had already mentioned, looking at external experts, and not just from an assurance perspective or independence perspective, but also in terms of PIABs using external experts, for instance, and also not just from a sustainability perspective, but also from technology perspective, from audit perspective. So those are a couple of things that certainly have brought to our attention, since the survey and through the other projects as well. But by no means that's not saying that part 2 is broken, but there are certain things that they kind of lead us to think that there are some enhancement opportunities and need there. So if there's no, Gabriela, please go ahead.
Thank you, Geoff. Just wanted to reiterate what you just said and confirm to Hilda that it is not our conviction that part 2 of the code is broken, or that we don't have an appropriate framework for PIABs, but we are seeing here an opportunity to be even better and to make the standards even more robust in a context where, and this touches upon what you said, Hilda, we see a role for PIABs and CFOs in particular to influence the culture of the companies with whom they work and where they work. The issue of the ethical culture of the company and the tone coming from the top is crucial, and the role that they play here is also crucial. And so we thought that we should explore some opportunities to reinforce the standards and to make them more agile and prone to support PIABs in fulfilling this role. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriela. Ken?
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. I just thought I'd just jump in as well with a very brief, I suppose, observation in relation to our expectations of PIBs. And as we've been reflecting on the way forward on sustainability, one clear realization has been that PIB's role, and in particular the role of CFOs, has been evolving very rapidly. A number of CFOs, to give you a very simple example, have taken on an additional role as ESG officer or sustainability chief sustainability officer and the like, and that just signals that we are, as we speak, we are seeing transformations in the role, the traditional role CFOs have been playing. And it is really incumbent upon IESBA to really look very, very intensely at those changes and the implications of those changes from an ethical perspective, insofar as CFOs are concerned. And we have to look at it not just in terms of trying to fill in the gaps in the code and to make the code a bit more tailored to sustainability considerations, if you will, but really looking at the distinct responsibilities of CFOs versus and others in similar senior positions versus those PIBs who perhaps have a bit of a lesser role or lesser role in terms of levels of authority and so forth within the organizations. So this is an area that is ripe for serious consideration, to my view. Our working group will be looking at this very intently, and certainly there is ample room for further discussion there as we explore the issues. Thank you.
Thanks, Ken. James?
Very quickly, I think we take Hilda's point, and what I've heard was a description that maybe wasn't best captured in raising the bar, and I think it gives us an opportunity to reflect on. I think what I'm hearing is ensuring strong ethics in alignment with changing circumstances. And I think maybe what Hilda was getting at is we should signal our expectations, and if raising the bar doesn't capture the best articulation, it's worth considering whether it does or other options. Thanks.
Thank you, James. And Conchita? Conchita, you're on mute. We might, Conchita, when maybe at the next opportunity can come back with your comments. I have been reminded that, in fact, I only have 10 minutes left to go through the rest of the presentation. So we've got a bit to go. Conchita, please go ahead.
Thank you. Actually, going through what has been said, I have to say that the team behind the strategic work plan did a good job. I would just like to probably add my dimension on the matter of raising the PIBs. I believe it is an important thing to consider. We have heard of major scandals, and the CFOs are involved. For example, the Wirecard scandal, which used technology and all that. And they even went to the market, and the price share went up. And the CFO is very much behind it. Of course, we don't know whether the CFO of Wirecard, I don't know whether he is a CP, professional accountant. They say those who know
Conchita, you're breaking up a little bit there. Jeff, we may, yeah. Jeff, we may need.
If I may, yeah, if I may reiterate, it's often said that those who know the rules know how to bend the rules. Therefore, we have to raise the bar for those who are behind managing the financial statements. It's not even preparing. In some cases, they manage the financial statements. Thank you.
Thank you, Conchita, for the comment. And thank you everyone for the very spirited discussions on PAIBs. I think the IFAC PAIB Advisory Group will be very delighted to hear the level of discussions here today. So let's keep moving on. We do have a few other areas to walk through with the CAG. Next slide, please, Diana. So we're looking at the next proposed strategic focus, which is strengthening the international independent standards for audit engagements. There is an acknowledgement that significant enhancements had been made to our independent standards over the last few years, particularly with non-insurance services, NAS, and fees, and also more recently revising the definition of public interest entity, PI. You see the first point there, the monitoring groups and other regulators have expressed support strong support to continue to focus on independent standards. And you've seen that IOSCO and IFIA have both provided additional comments in terms of areas they felt that IESBA can look at as we develop the consultation paper and the strategy and work plan. So I won't go through those because of time, but the planning committee had addressed some of these in the issues paper, which is a reference material in today's session. But also the point is that IESBA and the planning committee will certainly look into these suggestions from IOSCO and IFIA more closely as we develop the consultation paper. There is also a comment about ongoing benchmarking exercise that will help identify gaps and enhancements opportunities. And as you may know, after our benchmarking exercise against the SEC, US SEC regulations, we will look into other future opportunities in terms of benchmarking. But as we have mentioned in the past, it is quite an extensive exercise. It takes up quite a lot of resource. So we need to look at that, in light of other projects that are coming up, in the next few years. Next slide, please. Other respondents have asked IESBA to consider a pace of change to our international independent standards. What some of these respondents are saying is they're not saying that we should not make any changes. They're not saying that independent standards is not important, but they're just asking us as we consider future projects, to consider the pace of change and to allow sufficient time for them to adopt and implement the code. And they're also asking us to perhaps, have a greater focus on the more significant issues and also looking at providing the necessary adoption and implementation support as well. And other researchers and post-implementation use of these researchers and post-implementation review to determine if further enhancements to the code are needed. The board have certainly taken these comments into consideration. In terms of the rate of change and the volume of change, the board appreciates that it does take our stakeholders, PAOs and firms, a lot of time and resources to adopt, implement not only our code, of course, but other international and local standards. We will look at a few different things as we put together the our work plans for the next strategy period, and we recognize a few things that certainly we can do as a board to make it to work with our stakeholders. For instance, we will time our projects maybe better so they don't all get finalized at the same time, unless they all link together, and we need to do that. Take a more balanced approach in the future, have larger projects, but also some of the smaller projects that we can perhaps move along, which will be easier for adoption and implementations perspective. We will look at perhaps longer comment period and perhaps delaying our effective dates as appropriate to give more time to implement these changes. And I think one of the other things that we really want to perhaps focus more on or create more opportunities for is use of avenues, forums like roundtables. We have found them every time we use them very useful in collecting information and views early, and therefore we're really taking our stakeholders on a journey, not just from the standard setting point, but even in the scoping and initial information gathering stage. So it makes it a bit easier, I think, for our stakeholders, and certainly more recently from our tax planning and related services project. Certainly, the task force and the board find that the roundtable that they did in April a very helpful exercise. So we look at that as well. And as you would know, we do have a few post-implementation reviews coming up. So we'll look into that and look at whether there's any enhancement need to the code. And the first one up, as I've mentioned, is the NOCLA standards, and there'll be up for post-implementation review next year. Next slide, please, Diana. We've gone past that. So next slide, which is just a pause to see if CAG representatives have any comments. I do realize that it's already time. So if we can make these comments sort of short to the point, that would be great.
Jeff, we go to 45 after.
Okay, we'll just cut.
We have a little bit of time.
We'll just cut to closing comments a bit, I guess. But thank you, Galen. Any comments, please?
Jeff, I don't see any yet. So
okay, so let's keep going. Next slide, please. This is on adoption and implementation. No surprise that there's strong support for IESBA to continue to focus on adoption and implementation. I've mentioned about conducting PIRs, post-implementation reviews already. And there's suggestions for us to have a better understanding of the status of adoption. This is something that we are continuously doing already, and we work very closely with our IFAC colleagues on this. And IOSCO have made some suggestions to us when we're looking at post-implementation reviews, which we will take those into consideration. And there's a couple of comments said about E-code as well. If we can move to the next slide. We have also asked in our survey a question on operability issues. And I also have given us some feedback about timely and accurate translation of the code. But there's also other comments about use of non-authoritative material and looking at how we can further simplify the code and whether there's any potential inconsistencies. Now, some of these points, of course, as I've mentioned, when we get to the post-implementation review, for instance, when we're looking at the restructured code, with some of these points will be addressed as part of that PIR. And there's also a point about continued close coordination with IESBA, which we of course will do as part of our adoption and implementation focus. Next slide, please, Diana. So the PC have made some comments in the issues paper, and the board also discussed this a little bit. And essentially, in terms of translation and also improvement opportunities for our ECO, which is now the Electronic International Standards, EIS, we have conveyed these messages to our IFAC colleagues, and we will continue to work with them. I mentioned already about post-implementation reviews. One of the things that I want to draw to the CAG representatives' attention is in terms of the release of NAMs, non-authoritative material. We recognize that it is very useful and helpful to our stakeholders. So what the board will look at is in terms of, because we do have limited resource, and our remit is really standard setting. So we want to look at, as the needs come through, we will look at whether our role is to produce or whether our role is to facilitate, and very much case by case basis, but that's something that the board will continue to look at and address. Next slide, please, Diana. Sorry, I'm going through this rather quickly. Other environmental trends, I will add here that both IOSCO and IFIA have brought some comments, but more particularly with IOSCO, they have talked about being agile in resource allocations, which Gabriela had already mentioned in the outset, that whatever plans that we have, we need to continue to be agile. For instance, sustainability, we really just picked that up this year, and we really just hit the road running there. So we want to continue to demonstrate that we are being agile and being flexible, and consider expedited process for certain projects. So the board also recognizes this, and certainly we will continue to work on, for smaller projects that have a smaller scope, with less complexity. Then we will try to work through this with our due process quickly. And the board also discussed some of these points, last week as well. Next slide, please. There's a few other comments here. I might just pick on a couple of those. Firstly, as I mentioned earlier, there are some comments about technology, and all of these, in fact, have been looked at by the Biotechnology Working Group, and they have included many of these points in the draft final reports, which they will, the board already discussed this last week, and the working group will look at releasing the final report in the next few weeks or so. So these are being addressed, but more importantly, I think the board certainly get the message that the importance on looking at and monitoring the impact of technology. There's also a point about applicability of the code to SMPs and whether the board should consider its own LCE project, which is what IWSB is doing. The board's view, the PC and the board's view is that each of our projects, we do look at scalability as one of the key factors that the project will consider. So at this point, as you would know, that when we look at independence, we already have the differentiation between PIEs and non-PIEs. And so the board felt that at this stage there is no, there's not enough evidence, or there's no need for us to go down this track of a separate LCE project at this stage. Next slide, please. We've covered this, so next slide, please. So just want to pause here again and see if CAG representatives any comments about adoption, implementation, the operability issues, and some of the other environmental issues and trends raised. Paul?
Thank you, Jeff. I assume you can hear me loud and clear.
Yes, thank you.
Great. Yeah, just picking up on the SMP point that you just referred to. Completely recognize the reasons for the board not wishing to pick up an equivalent of the LCE project that's being developed by the IWSB. I do wonder, however, whether ethics board staff might learn something from the CUSP project on the IESB, the one on complexity, usability, scalability, and proportionality. Perhaps there's just a few things that can be learned from your IESB colleagues in relation to just making the code a little bit more readable, understandable, less complex, etc. And just sort of finally, more sort of general point, circling back to the number of respondents that we had. Somewhat disappointed that we didn't get more than 50 respondents to this survey. It wasn't a difficult survey to respond to. I do hope that many more will respond to the next stage of the consultation. And with that in mind, I just wondered whether or not the board had any specific plans on how to increase the number of respondents. And here I'm obviously, from a selfish perspective, it's nice to have more SMPs and SMEs responding, but it's also nice to have a lot more investor groups respond too. Where they appear to be pretty thin on the ground in terms of the number of respondents. That's all, Jeff.
Thank you, Paul. Hildy?
Thank you. A very quick comment. Some of these matters are actually interrelated. Focus on adoption and implementation, very good. We feel very much supported. In Europe, it's less and less good and it's less and less timely, but there is a trade-off with then why people are not doing it as they used to do, or not as quickly, or not at all. And they say, well, we need it. There's so many changes, so we need a pause because we just can't cope. And then they also said, and some of the subject matters like on non-audit services, on fees, it's not easy. We need more guidance in order to really be able to adopt and to implement. And so there is a trade-off between a few of those matters that you have in your strategy. Whatever is most important will influence what else you can do. Thank you.
Thank you, Hildy. Thank you, Paul. And certainly noting your comment about IESB CUSP project, and for us to perhaps look at what they are working on there. I will also say that, as I mentioned, that as we work on the post-implementation review on a restructured code, that could be something that we will look at in terms of whether it's too complex or whether there's any substantive room for us to make it easier for stakeholders. And in terms of the number of respondents, for instance, I would say, for instance, that point was also raised by one of our board members last week. And as we have mentioned that, for instance, we look at organizations such as, IOSCO and IFIA, they are, certainly very well represented there. So we wouldn't just look at the actual number like that there. But in terms of your points about getting more investors responding, we certainly take that on board. As you would know, and as we've mentioned in the past, that there is the formal responses process, but we're also trying to get more informal responses as we go out and conduct outreaches with different stakeholder groups, not just for those from the profession, but particularly those who are outside the profession. And I think certainly as we look into sustainability, that's something that we recognize is we can't just talk to the profession. And so we will continue to talk to those who are in the investors community, those in the corporate governance community, and really try to get their feedback. Perhaps, they might not want to do formal responses. It might take them a bit time, but I think, we can still get the informal responses, which is equally important. But thank you for that comment and observation. Ken.
Thanks a lot, Jeff. Just a couple of reactions to Paul's comments. Always very welcome, Paul, and thank you for your input. I would say on the matter of scalability and the LC project, and you also referred to the cost project the IESB has been following or pursuing. I would say, listen, we spent 5 years on IESBA to restructure the code. And it was only a couple of years ago. And if anything, we have fed our lessons on our restructuring of the code project to the IESB's work stream. So, but listen, you know, we would be the first ones, I would say, to eat our humble pie. And, you know, if there is anything that we can learn from their efforts, we will take it, you know, very gladly and enthusiastically. So that's one. On the matter of engagement with the investor community in particular, we have spoken to, and we continue to, first of all, engage with investor representatives. In fact, Gabriela and I will be in Brussels next month, and we are engaging with Better Finance, IFAMA, and you know, and the like, and these are investor organizations. So definitely we're talking to them. But as a group, as a representative group, first of all, they're not really organized internationally, and really we turn to the CAG as a proxy, if you will, or as a substitute, and really make the most of what we hear from the CAG. But also recently we've been engaging with some people who have a direct connectivity into the investor community, and what we learn from them is investors, by and large, have a natural tendency to trust audited financial statements. And particularly when we talk to auditors, their primary focus is on has been on the audited financial statements. Admittedly, there's a clear pivot to sustainability and so forth, but historically it has been on the audited financial statements, and they have tended to look at the audit as a given, and unless there is a big scandal breaking out, they are not going to be particularly concerned about opening up kind of worms, if you were trying to poke into a company's numbers if they don't otherwise have a signal that there is something amiss. That said, in certain jurisdictions there are a limited number of investors who are interested in accounting and auditing issues. By and large, investors do not feel that they are qualified enough to comment on accounting and auditing issues. That's what we hear from those who've been engaging with them. That's feedback I'm sharing. But there are, as I say, there are a few of the investor community who are interested. And it is really a matter for us to really identify who these individuals are, really engaging with them almost kind of at the grassroots level rather than at an organizational level. And that's really the best way to approach it. And that's how we've been trying to do it. Gabriela.
Thank you, Ken. Yes, and I would add that investors are a very fragmented group in terms of profiles, in terms of backgrounds, in terms of how they organize them with the others. We have from the individual investor who can be very fragile and distant from the more sophisticated topics until those who really drive the agenda, and they are driving the agenda. So we are quite aware, and I reinforce this, we are quite aware not only of the importance of connecting with them, but mainly to understand what their needs are, because if we are, of course, not only working for investors, they are probably one of the most relevant end users of non-financial information and financial information, and so we have to take them in account. That's what we have been doing. I confirm what Ken has been, what Ken has just said, trying to reach out to them, but the very diverse nature of this group of stakeholders makes it very difficult not only to reach out to them, but also when we manage to do so, to take the input as being representative of the class and of the group, because they have different interests, different perspectives, and very different levels of sophistication and understanding of what it means, what we are doing here. So, well, we will not give up, and we will keep on getting as much as possible input from that sector. But it's a great effort, and it's probably the most difficult group to reach out to.
Thank you, Gabriela and Ken, for the additional feedback. Diana, so we might move to the next slide.
Jeff, I note that we're kind of at the end of our allotted time, so we probably need to make the most important points at this point. I don't know how much longer we're starting to see a couple people drop off, so
okay,
if you can try to get to the conclusion faster.
Yes, I will talk very quickly and make it very short, and perhaps just a couple more minutes to hear feedback from others if they have any. So we can move to the next slide, Diana. So we have covered 10 topics. Hopefully you had a chance to look at them already last week. So we can go to the next slide. Just to give you a sense of the respective, I guess, priorities that are given by different groups. You see in the top left corner there's just overall scoring by not every respondent, but those who have provided us with the scoring. And of course, IOSCO also provided input. And then at the bottom two slides, the bottom two tables, we have given you the priority from the profession and also other regulators and the independent national standard setters. What the board's discussion last week, perhaps we'll start with that and probably end with that, is we started with the regulators, their priority for us, particularly looking into IOSCO. So we noticed that in terms of independence of external experts, you can almost write that out as a future strategy topic because we are already doing it now. So as we go into the next strategy plan, that will become a pre-commitment and ongoing project already. But we did look at, for instance, business relationships. That is something that certainly both technology groups, the technology projects, but also the technology working group have highlighted aspects. And as you've seen in the technology projects, they've already made some changes there. And so that's something that, the board have discussed and looking at that as well. Non-authoritative material, as I've mentioned, we will continue to look at it and also juggling in terms of our resource, and we'll look at, depending on the nature and the content, whether we will produce or whether we'll facilitate with some of facilitate the release of them and work with our stakeholders. Definitions and descriptions of terms, that's been brought up, particularly in the context of making sure that we align our terms and definitions with our sister board, with IESBA. So the board will take on board of those comments as well. And there's the audit firm and audit client relationship, not so much about the business model perspective, but looking at in terms of from an independence perspective, range of threats might arise, particularly, for instance, self-interest threats when the audit client is paying the firm. But also there is the question, as we put in the survey, about the term itself, audit client, whether that is the best term, and so the board will look at that as well, going forward as we develop the draft consultation paper. Diana, if you can move to the next slide. As I've mentioned earlier at the start, the board and the planning committee will also take into consideration a range of things as we put as we develop the draft consultation paper for the board's discussion in December. And I've mentioned some of these. So perhaps I'll just open the floor now and then see if any CAG representatives have any comments about these 10 projects. And maybe, Diana, if you can move to the next slide, we'll list the 10 projects or 10 potential projects and initiatives there. I know that we've run out of time. My apologies. So Any additional comments? Feel free to send me comments afterwards, of course. But any comments that representatives want to raise at this point?
Jeff, I have a comment on number 7, definition of audit client, and it came up in the board last week. I really think that does need to be looked at from a cultural standpoint, because until we get past the idea that the client is the company that you audited, even if they're paying you, the client is really the users, and it's really investors, it's really the public. And from that standpoint, maybe if you change that definition, it change the way people start thinking about who their real responsibility is to.
Thanks, and of course that point also relates to what is a related entity, and that's kind of what the board was. But thank you for the comments, Galen. Any additional comments? Any other comments from our CAG representatives?
We can still take a couple of minutes, folks. This is important if you have some feelings. All right, I'm not seeing any hands, and knowing that we're already past due. Dave, do you want to make any comments on this section or the entire meeting, either day 1 or day 2 in the sort of wrap-up phase of this?
Thanks, Galen. Just a couple of things quickly, appreciating the time. Thanks for the presentation, Jeff, and for all of the feedback. Certainly, I'm interested in seeing the draft consultation paper and ultimately the feedback that you all get in terms of that to see what's important to all of the constituencies. But clearly, some things that are important to me are strengthening the independence of the professional accountant in public practice, and also the independence of external experts, as we've said already, whether it's in connection with the audit or in connection with sustainability, because experts are so important to the process of the audit. And I would expect that the consultation paper will have a clear focus on the public interest, as well as the implementation of the monitoring group reforms. So thanks for the ability to respond to that. And then again, just let me say thank you to all of the CAG members for your active involvement in these meetings, because it's so important to the process and so important to the getting the feedback that we need to make sure that the standards are useful and in the public interest. So thanks again. Galen?
Yeah, and Gabriela, I'll invite you to any concluding remarks you might have.
Thank you very much, Galen. Just a very brief concluding statement. Again, just as I said before, this is important for us to have your feedback. What we aim at with this exercise of discussing, holding a dialogue with the CAG, is to make sure that we do not miss anything. And a few things that we heard here today will certainly help guiding us and adjusting the direction that we will take in terms of the strategy and the work plan. Thank you very much to all of you and for your very, very valuable contributions. And we hope to be able to present something which is of value by December in terms of what we are going to do next. And thank you, Geoff, for the excellent presentation.
I'll thank Jeff as well as all the CAG members. Thank you for your engagement today. Thank you for your ongoing support of the things that we're trying to accomplish here. And with that, we'll close the meeting. Except I do need to make an announcement or a reminder. I guess we have Carla, we have a meeting coming up in October. I'm looking for it in my notes here. Go ahead, Carla. Carla, would you?
Monday, the 3rd of October.
Yes, and that's a joint IASB and IESBA CAG session on it's very important, so we don't want to miss this, on the transition plan that'll take place over the course of the next year. With that, we'll close this meeting then. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, and have a good weekend. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.